She offered him $3 million, and he laughed. Not the nervous laugh of a man pretending to be brave, not the polite chuckle of someone buying time. Ethan Cross laughed the way a man laughs when he knows something you don't. Quiet, certain, a little sad around the edges. Victoria Hale had never been turned down before. Not once. Not by city councils, not by rival developers, not by men with far more power than a grease-stained mechanic in a dying neighborhood. But Ethan Cross wasn't just a mechanic, and that garage wasn't just a garage. If you want to know what was behind that steel door, stay with me until the end. Drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And let's begin. Mercer Street didn't die overnight. It happened the way most things fall apart. Slowly, then all at once. First the bakery on the corner closed, then the hardware store, then the family that had lived in the blue house with the wraparound porch for 40 years took a developer's check and moved to Arizona. Their daughter cried the whole drive out of the city. Their son didn't look back once. Different ways of grieving the same loss. By the time Ethan Cross noticed what was happening, the street he'd grown up on looked like a mouth missing half its teeth. Empty lots where buildings used to stand. Chain-link fences with orange notices stapled to them. The particular silence of a place being erased. Cross Automotive sat at the far end of Mercer Street like a man who hadn't gotten the memo. 2 bays, a small office with a window that fogged in winter, a hand-painted sign that Ethan's father had hung in 1987 and never replaced. The paint was faded now, the letters slightly uneven because his father had done it himself on a Sunday afternoon, while Ethan, then 7 years old, handed him the brush and asked too many questions. That sign stayed crooked for 31 years. Ethan never fixed it. Some things you don't fix because they're broken. You leave them because they're real. The garage smelled like motor oil, rubber, and the particular metallic tang of old engines that have been worked on for so long, they've developed a kind of personality. Ethan knew every corner of the place the way you know a house you've slept in since childhood, instinctively, without having to think about it. The third step to the office squeaked. The far bay light flickered for exactly 2 seconds when you first switched it on. The back wall had a faint water stain shaped like the state of Florida that Ethan had been meaning to repaint for 6 years. He never did. The garage was not beautiful. It was not modern. It was not particularly impressive to look at if you were driving past at 40 miles an hour. But it was his. And more than that, it was his father's, and his father's hands had touched every corner of it, and his father was gone now. And the garage was the last place on earth where Ethan could still feel the presence of that man without it hurting quite so much. That mattered. It mattered more than money. But nobody standing outside the situation would have understood that, and Ethan had long since stopped expecting them to. It was a Tuesday when the suits arrived. Ethan was underneath a 2009 Ford F-150 with a busted transmission, a situation that required his full attention and his least favorite vocabulary when he heard the footsteps on the concrete floor. Too many footsteps. Too deliberate. The sound of people who had rehearsed their entrance. He rolled out from under the truck. 3 of them. 2 men in gray suits carrying folders, and a woman who was not carrying anything at all. The kind of person who doesn't need props. She was younger than he'd expected. Early 30s, same as him, but the kind of 30 that looks like it came with a management team in a strategy meeting. Dark blazer, dark hair pulled back in a way that suggested efficiency rather than style. She was looking around the garage the way a person looks at something they've already decided to replace. Ethan sat up, wiped his hands on a rag that was already beyond saving, and said nothing. One of the suited men stepped forward, extending a business card. Ethan didn't take it. "Mr. Cross." The man's voice was smooth, trained for this moment. "My name is Daniel Reeve. I represent Hale Development Group. We've been trying to reach you by—" "I know what you've been trying to do," Ethan said. He stood up slowly, not hurrying. "I've been getting the letters. Then you know why we're here." "I do." Ethan turned back toward the truck. "Answer's the same as what I wrote back. No." A pause. He could feel the energy in the room shift. The slight recalibration that happens when someone powerful encounters resistance they weren't fully prepared for. The woman spoke. Her voice was different from the lawyer's, less polished, but more direct. the kind of directness that doesn't need volume. "Mr. Cross, I'm Victoria Hale." He turned back around. He'd expected her to be older, honestly. The name Hale Development Group carried a weight that suggested decades in boardrooms and someone who had been doing this since before he was born. But she was young, and her eyes were sharp in a way that reminded him of a chess player, always 3 moves ahead, already mapping exits and contingencies. "I know who you are," he said. "Then you know I don't usually make site visits." She looked around again, at the tools on the pegboard, the stack of tires against the wall, the '68 Chevelle up on the left bay lift that belonged to a retired school teacher named Gerald, who couldn't afford to pay in full and was paying in installments. "I'm here because I thought it might help to speak directly." "It might," Ethan said, "but it won't change anything." Victoria tilted her head slightly, not annoyed, more like recalibrating. "Can I ask why?" "You can ask." "Well," she almost smiled. Almost. "Why?" Ethan looked at her for a moment, then looked at the garage around him, at the sign his father had painted, at the water stain that looked like Florida, at Gerald's Chevelle, and the invoices tacked to the board and the coffee maker in the corner that had been running since 6 that morning and would keep running until he turned it off at night. "Because it's mine," he said, "and it's not for sale." Victoria didn't leave after that first refusal. She did something that told Ethan more about her than she probably intended. She asked if she could sit down. Not in the boardroom sense. She pointed at the metal folding chair next to the parts shelf and asked if she could sit in it, and she said please, which was either genuine or a calculated move so practiced it had become genuine through repetition. Ethan said fine. She sat. He leaned against the workbench with his arms crossed, not hostile, but not open either. The 2 lawyers stood near the entrance looking slightly lost, the way men in expensive suits always look when they're standing in a working garage. "Tell me what you want," Victoria said. "Not what you don't want, what you want." "I want to keep the garage." "And if I offered you enough to open 3 garages somewhere else?" "There isn't somewhere else." She studied him. "Mr. Cross, I've done my research on this property. The structure has deferred maintenance issues. The neighborhood around it has declined significantly. The assessed value—" "I know the assessed value," Ethan said. "I know what it looks like on paper." "Then you know our offer is generous." "It's more than generous. It's almost insulting in how generous it is." He said this without heat, the way you state a fact. "And it doesn't matter." Victoria was quiet for a moment. One of her lawyers shifted his weight. Outside, a truck went by on Mercer Street, and the sound of it filled the silence. "Is it the number?" she asked. "Because I can adjust the number." "It's not the number." "Is it relocation? We can assist with It's not relocation." "Then what?" She stopped. She took a breath. This was someone who had trained herself not to show frustration, and the training was holding, but only barely. "Help me understand what I'm missing here." Ethan looked at the ceiling for a moment, at the same water stain on the ceiling from 2019 when the roof had a bad winter. Then he looked back at her. "My father built this garage in 1987, he said. He was 24 years old and he had $600 in a loan from his uncle, and he worked 16-hour days for 2 years before he could pay himself a salary. He met my mother because she brought her car in for a transmission problem in 1989. They got married in 1991. I was born in 1993. My father taught me to hold a wrench before I could read." He paused. "He died in this building, heart attack, 2019. He was working alone because I was away. I was doing other things. I wasn't here." The garage went very quiet. "I'm sorry," Victoria said. She said it simply. No strategy in it. "Thank you," Ethan said. "And that's why it's not about the number." She nodded slowly. And for a moment, just a moment, he thought she actually understood. But then she straightened slightly, and he could see her shifting back into the version of herself that had made $100 million before she was 30. "I understand the sentimental value," she said. "But sentiment isn't a business plan, Mr. Cross. Sentiment doesn't keep the lights on." Something closed in Ethan's expression. Not anger. More like disappointment, the kind that comes from watching someone almost get it and then not. "No," he agreed. "It doesn't. But some things are worth more than the lights." She left 15 minutes later. The lawyers followed her like satellites returning to orbit. At the door, she turned back. "I'll leave the offer open," she said. "Think about it." "I have thought about it," Ethan said. "The answer is still no." The door swung shut behind her. Ethan stood in the middle of his garage for a long moment, listening to the sound of a car starting in the parking lot outside. Then he picked up his rag and went back to Gerald's Chevelle. He had work to do. Here is what Victoria Hale did not know about Ethan Cross, because the research her team had done was thorough, but not thorough enough. 10 years before he was the owner of a faded garage on Mercer Street, Ethan Cross had worked for Hartwell Dynamics, a boutique automotive engineering firm based out of Detroit that built cars for people who thought a Ferrari was a reasonable starting point for negotiations. He had not been a mechanic there. He had been a lead engineer, the kind of mind that doesn't just understand how engines work, but understands why. Down to the molecular level of metallurgy and thermodynamics and the elegant mathematics of combustion. He had been, by most accounts, exceptional. His colleagues called him the surgeon because of the precision he brought to his work. Where other engineers would tolerate a tolerance of plus or minus 0.02 of an inch, Ethan would spend an extra 4 hours getting it to 1. Not because the specs demanded it, because he couldn't stand anything less. He had helped to design the Hartwell Spectra, a limited production performance vehicle that had won 3 international engineering awards and been written about in publications that normal car enthusiasts couldn't pronounce. Only 12 were ever built. The waiting list, at its peak, had 47 names on it. Then his wife got sick. Mara Cross had been diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer 2 months after their daughter Lily was born. What followed was the kind of 2 years that rearranges a person at a fundamental level: hospital visits and treatment schedules and the specific exhaustion of being terrified and hopeful, and terrified again, in cycles that never quite synchronized with the rest of the world. Ethan had taken leave from Hartwell. Then he had quit Hartwell. Then Mara had died on a Thursday in November, when Lily was 22 months old and still too young to understand what had happened, which was both a mercy and a wound that would take years to find the edges of. He had moved back to Mercer Street. He had picked up his father's tools, his father who had died 6 months before Mara, in a cruel compression of loss that still occasionally struck Ethan in the chest at unexpected moments, like pressing a bruise you'd forgotten was there. He had become a mechanic, not because he couldn't do other things, not because the engineering world had closed its doors to him. They would have welcomed him back with offers and titles and offices with windows, but because the garage was the last place he could go where both his father and his wife still existed in some form. His father in the tools and the layout and the crooked sign outside. Mara in the promise he'd made her. That Lily would grow up somewhere safe, somewhere real, somewhere that meant something. Lily was now 7. She did her homework at the small desk Ethan had put in the corner of the office. She knew the names of most common engine components and had once, age 6, correctly identified a faulty alternator by sound, which had made Ethan laugh harder than he'd laughed in months. She was the reason for everything. The garage was the shape that reason took. The first city inspector arrived on a Monday morning, 3 weeks after Victoria's visit. His name was Patterson. He had a clipboard and the expression of a man performing a task he had been specifically assigned to perform. He walked through the garage with that clipboard like he was reading a verdict someone else had already written, pausing at things that had not been cited in the last inspection, noting violations in a handwriting so careful it looked like he was transcribing scripture. "Electrical panel," Patterson said, pointing. "Out of code compliance. Updated in 2016, but the standard changed in 2020. "Every garage on the west side of the city has that same panel," Ethan said. "Yes, sir. They'll be receiving notices too." They wouldn't. Ethan already knew that, but he kept his voice level. "Bay door mechanism. Manual override not compliant with current fire egress requirements. It's been that way for 12 years. "Yes, sir." Still out of compliance. By the time Patterson left, he'd written up 7 violations. Some were legitimate. Most were the kind of technicalities that existed in every building in every aging neighborhood, violations that lay dormant for decades unless someone decided to look for them. Someone had decided to look. The second inspector came the following Wednesday. Different name, same clipboard, same performance. He found 4 more violations. One of them was a crack in a concrete floor section that Ethan's father had poured himself in 1989. The lawyer's letter arrived on Friday. It was 3 pages, single-spaced, and detailed how the accumulated violations placed the property in a position of potential condemnation, and how, under certain municipal redevelopment ordinances, properties deemed structurally deficient within designated development zones could be subject to eminent domain proceedings. And wasn't that interesting, given the circumstances? Ethan read the letter twice at the kitchen table after Lily went to sleep. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the drawer with the other documents. The deed, the insurance papers, the letters from Hartwell he'd never answered, and the birthday card Mara had written him in the hospital 6 weeks before she died, that he had read so many times he'd memorized it, but still couldn't throw away. He sat in the kitchen for a while without turning on the lights. Then he went to bed. In the morning, he took Lily to school, bought a coffee from the truck on 5th that made it slightly too bitter, the way he liked it, and drove back to the garage and opened the bay doors and went to work. If they wanted to unsettle him, they needed to find something that still had the capacity to be unsettled. There are different ways to fight. Ethan had learned this lesson not in the garage and not in any boardroom, but in the months after Mara died when he had to decide whether to collapse or continue. There was no third option. He'd stood at that fork for a long time, and eventually he chose to continue, not because he was particularly strong. He said he didn't think of himself that way, but because Lily existed and needed him, and that was sufficient reason to take the next step and then the one after that. Fighting publicly had never been his instinct. He wasn't a marching sign type of man. He wasn't comfortable behind a microphone or in front of a camera. He was the kind of person who processed things internally, who thought through angles and outcomes before speaking, whose silences were often misread as passivity by people who hadn't figured out the difference between quiet and defeated. He was not defeated. He spent 3 evenings in the office after Lily was in bed, doing research. Not on legal strategies or zoning laws. He'd leave that to people who understood those systems better than he did. He was researching people. Specifically, 2. The first was a man named Robert Ashford, 64 years old, based in Connecticut, one of the most respected private automobile collectors in the country. Ashford's collection was legendary in the small, insular world of serious collectors. Cars that had history, not just in the mechanical sense, but in the cultural one. He had a reputation for discretion, for deep knowledge, and for becoming extremely interested when he encountered something genuinely rare. The second was a journalist named Marcus Teller, 41, based locally, investigative reporter for the Regional Herald, the kind of publication that still employed 3 full-time reporters and broke stories that the larger outlets would eventually pick up and claim credit for. Teller had a particular history of following money through municipal processes in ways that made people uncomfortable. He had the face of someone's middle school history teacher and the instincts of a hunting dog. Ethan called Ashford first. He didn't leave a message, just his name and a brief description of what he had. He didn't exaggerate. He didn't sell. He simply said there were vehicles here that Ashford would want to see and left it at that. Ashford called back within an hour. Then Ethan called Marcus Teller. That conversation took longer. "Why do you want a reporter?" Teller asked. Direct, suspicious. The right kind of suspicious for someone in his line of work. "Because something's happening here that I think you'd want to document," Ethan said. "Something the development company would prefer not be documented?" "I think they'd prefer a lot of things that aren't going to happen." A pause on the line. Ethan could hear Teller thinking, which was a sound most people couldn't hear, but he'd learned to recognize in conversations with people who actually processed information before responding. "What exactly are you offering me?" Teller asked. "A story," Ethan said. "Okay, a real one. I'm not going to tell you what to write or how to write it. I'm going to show you something, and then you can decide what it is." "And the collection you mentioned." "I didn't mention a collection." Another pause. "Right, okay. When do you want me there?" They settled on a morning 2 weeks out. Ethan wanted time to make one phone call first, to Marcus Donahue, his old contact in the city's property records office, a man who owed him a favor from 2021 involving a water pump and a very unfortunate Thanksgiving timing situation. There were things in those records that Ethan wanted to understand before anyone else started asking questions. The morning Ashford and Teller arrived, the weather was doing what it often did in October, making up its mind between seasons, gray sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to rain. They arrived separately. Ashford first, in a car that was itself worth more than most houses, driven by a man who appeared to work for him and said nothing. Ashford himself was tall, lean, the kind of man who wore a blazer casually in the way of someone who'd worn blazers for 40 years and no longer thought about them. He shook Ethan's hand with the grip of a man who meant it. Teller arrived 7 minutes later on a bicycle, which somehow made perfect sense. He had a notebook, an actual paper notebook, in his jacket pocket and eyes that cataloged everything he walked past. He shook Ethan's hand, looked around the garage with professional curiosity and said, "Nice water stain." "Florida," Ethan agreed. "I was going to say Idaho, but sure." It was the kind of exchange that meant nothing and somehow broke the tension of the morning, which Ethan thought was probably intentional on Teller's part. Ashford was already studying Gerald's Chevelle with the focused attention of a physician examining a patient. "What year?" he asked. "68, Ethan said. "Restoration project for a customer. She's not one of mine." "One of yours?" Ashford repeated, letting the phrase land. "All right, let's see." Ethan led them to the back of the garage, past the parts shelving, past the rack of used tires in various states of wear, past the board where he posted invoices and schedules, and in the corner, a crayon drawing Lily had done of Daddy's work that he'd taped up without thinking and never taken down. There was a steel door in the back wall that neither Ashford nor Teller had initially noticed because it was the same color as the wall, and there was a shelving unit placed at a slight angle in front of it. Not hidden, exactly, just not announced. Ethan moved the shelving unit. It was on wheels. He'd engineered it that way. Another thing people didn't notice unless they were looking for it. He unlocked the door with a key on a separate ring from his regular keys. Heavier, older, a Medeco cylinder that had been installed by a locksmith he'd brought in specifically for this purpose. The door swung open on well-oiled hinges. The temperature on the other side was immediately different. Climate-controlled, precise. The lighting was low and warm at first because the system didn't know anyone was coming. Then Ethan hit the switches. Ashford made a sound. It was not a word. It was a sound a man makes when he has spent 40 years searching for something beautiful and he has just found it. Teller's pen was already moving. The room was larger than it should have been. What had looked, from the front of the garage, like dead space behind the back wall, was actually a carefully constructed extension. Permitted, properly built, and deliberately designed to be invisible from street level. Ethan had funded the construction 3 years ago from savings he'd been accumulating since selling the last of his Hartwell stock options, a decision that had felt reckless at the time and now felt like the only reasonable thing he'd ever done. 9 vehicles. 8 in various states of display, positioned with the specific care of someone who understood that presentation was its own form of respect. The 9th, in the far corner, covered with a custom cloth that was itself expensive. Ashford moved through the space slowly, his blazer on, his hands clasped behind his back, in a posture that Ethan recognized, the absolute stillness of a man exercising profound self-control in the presence of extraordinary things. There was a 1969 Chevrolet Camaro ZL1, not a clone, not a tribute, but a documented original, one of 69 produced, with a build sheet and window sticker that Ashford would later spend 45 minutes examining with the reverence of a scholar handling a manuscript. The paint was original. So was the interior. The mileage, 7,412, had been confirmed by an independent authentication service 6 months prior. There was a 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda convertible, 4-speed, Rally Red. One of 14 ever produced in that exact configuration, a number that Ashford confirmed quietly without being asked, because it was the kind of fact serious collectors know the way most people know their own phone numbers. There was a 1967 Shelby GT 500. There was a 1971 Boss 351 Mustang. There were 3 others that Teller, in his notes, described as cars that require expertise I don't possess to adequately describe. And even I can tell they're exceptional. And then there was the ninth car, the one under the cloth. Ethan looked at Ashford. Ashford looked at the cloth. There was a moment where nobody said anything. "May I?" Ashford asked. Ethan nodded. Ashford moved to the far corner and lifted the edge of the cloth with the careful attention of a man who understood that certain moments in life deserved to be treated with ceremony. He lifted it from the front, folding it back slowly, revealing the car inch by inch. It was not the most beautiful car in the room. It was not trying to be. Where the muscle cars around it spoke in the visual language of aggression and speed, this vehicle spoke in something quieter, a pure mechanical language of engineering purpose. It was low, almost aggressively so. The body panels had the smooth continuity of something designed by mathematics rather than fashion. It was painted a color that was not quite silver and not quite gray, a color that existed in the space between, and in the controlled lighting it seemed to shift as you moved around it. It was the prototype, the only one. A vehicle that Ethan had spent 11 months of his life at Hartwell designing and that had never gone to production because the company had pivoted to a different market segment 18 months before completion, and Ethan had made arrangements, legal and careful arrangements, to ensure that when it left Hartwell's ownership, it did not disappear into some collector's sealed climate room or a museum's storage facility. It had come here. It had always been going to come here, he thought, though he hadn't known that at the time. Ashford stood in front of it for a long time. "Is this what I think it is?" he said finally. "Depends what you think it is," Ethan said. "I think," Ashford said carefully, "that this is the Hartwell Crestline prototype, the vehicle listed in the company's asset sale as destroyed during testing." "Things get mislabeled," Ethan said. Ashford turned to look at him. His expression was complex. Admiration, calculation, and something that might have been mild reproach, though not the kind that expected a response. "Do you know what this is worth?" he said. "I have some idea." "You have—" Ashford stopped, turned back to the car. This car, authenticated with documentation, would be the centerpiece of any serious collection in the world. There are private buyers who would, Mr. Cross, there are people who would pay 8 figures for this vehicle. 8 figures. $10 million at the low end of that range. Teller had stopped writing. He was looking at Ethan with an expression that contained the particular intensity of a journalist who has just realized that the story he thought he was covering is actually a much larger story. "You've been sitting on this," Teller said. Not a question. "I've been keeping it safe," Ethan said. "There's a difference." "And the inspectors, the legal pressure, Hale Development." Teller was thinking out loud now, the notebook back up. "They don't know." "They know what's visible from the street," Ethan said. "They think they're pressuring a struggling mechanic into selling a marginally valuable property." "That's my understanding of their position, yes." Teller and Ashford looked at each other briefly. Then Teller looked at Ethan. "Mr. Cross," he said slowly, "why did you bring me here?" Ethan looked at the cars around him, at the ZL1 and the Hemi-Cuda and the Shelby and the prototype under its cloth, at all the things he'd gathered and protected and maintained in this room where his daughter had never been, because she was too young to understand the stakes and too precious to be burdened by them. "Because something happened in this neighborhood," he said. "Not just to me. To the people who used to live here. The families who got offered checks and felt like they didn't have a choice. The woman who ran the alteration shop on Mercer for 22 years. The Guerrero family who had to close their restaurant." He paused. "And I want what happened to be on the record. All of it. Not just the part where I win." Teller wrote something in his notebook. Then he looked up. "What makes you think you're going to win?" he asked. Ethan Cross looked at him steadily. "Because I'm not trying to win money," he said. "I'm trying to win something they don't know how to take from me." The 3 men stood in the climate-controlled room among the cars, and outside the October sky finally decided it was going to rain, and the sound of it on the roof was steady and even, like something that had made up its mind. The morning after Ashford and Teller left, Ethan drove Lily to school. She was in the back seat with a peanut butter sandwich she was eating in defiance of the rule against eating in the car, and she had a question about clouds, specifically whether clouds had feelings, and if they did, whether they were sad when they rained or relieved. "I think relieved," Ethan said. Like when you need to sneeze and then you sneeze? Exactly like that. So rain is basically cloud sneezing. That is one way to think about it. Lily considered this with the seriousness that 7-year-olds bring to information they are deciding whether to keep. I'm going to tell Emma that today, she announced. She doesn't know anything about clouds. He watched her walk into the school building, her backpack slightly too large for her frame, one shoelace that he'd tied twice already coming loose again. He sat in the car long after she disappeared through the doors, not because he was worried about today, but because he was doing what he'd been doing since Mara died, cataloging moments, banking them somewhere internal, aware of the specific weight of ordinary things. Then he drove back to Mercer Street and called Marcus Donahue at the property records office. What Donahue told him confirmed what he'd suspected. The timeline of the inspection escalation correlated precisely, within 72 hours, of Victoria Hale's visit to the garage. There were requisition records, internal memo timestamps, assignment notifications, nothing illegal on its face. But the correlation was there, documented in the municipal system, available to anyone who knew how to read the filing structure and had reason to look. Teller would know how to read it. Ethan took the notes Donahue had provided, organized them into the kind of clear sequence that made sense to people who weren't familiar with bureaucratic filing systems, and sent them to Teller's secure email. Then he went back to the garage, opened the bay doors, and got to work. Gerald's Chevelle wasn't going to fix itself. In the 2 weeks that followed, nothing happened. On the surface, below the surface, Marcus Teller was making calls. Robert Ashford had, very quietly, reached out to 2 other collectors he trusted absolutely, individuals whose opinions carried the kind of weight in certain circles that changes rooms when they walk into them. The story was not yet public. The collection was not yet known. But the conditions that would make those things public were being carefully assembled. Ethan worked. He fixed Gerald's Chevelle. Gerald came in on a Thursday afternoon to see the progress and ran his hand along the restored hood with an expression that Ethan recognized as the face of someone who has been missing something for a very long time and can now see it returning. "She's coming back," Gerald said. "She's almost back," Ethan said. He fixed a 2014 Honda Civic with a stubborn brake issue. He replaced a timing chain on a Subaru Outback that its owner had been ignoring for 18 months longer than was advisable. He changed oil for the retired schoolteacher 3 streets over who brought her 2007 Camry in every 4 months without fail. Normal work. The kind of work his father had done for 30 years on this same floor. Lily's soccer team had a game on Saturday. She played midfield with more enthusiasm than technical skill, which was exactly appropriate for a 7-year-old. And she scored 1 goal accidentally because she'd closed her eyes right before kicking and the ball had done something unexpected. She was prouder of that goal than any she'd actually aimed at. Ethan watched from the sideline and applauded and didn't think about Victoria Hale at all. But the quiet wouldn't last. He knew that. The story, once it broke, would not be quiet. And the woman in the dark blazer, who had built an empire on controlling outcomes, was about to encounter the particular problem of an outcome she hadn't built into her models. A man who had already decided what mattered to him, years before she'd arrived, and who was therefore completely unmovable on all the things that actually counted. In the back room, behind the steel door, the prototype sat in its controlled temperature, silver gray and patient, as if it had been waiting for exactly this. It probably had. Marcus Teller's article ran on a Wednesday morning, which was not the day Ethan had expected. He'd thought Thursday, maybe Friday. Teller had mentioned the editorial cycle in passing, something about how the Herald's weekend readership was stronger and bigger stories often got held for it. But Wednesday it was, which meant either Teller had pushed for it or his editor had seen something in the draft that couldn't wait. Ethan found out the same way most people found out that morning. His phone started ringing before he'd finished his first cup of coffee. The first call was from Gerald. "Ethan, you're on the internet." "I know." "Not like a little bit, like a lot." "I know, Gerald." The second call was from his sister Claire, who lived in Portland and who called him approximately 4 times a year, which meant that this particular Wednesday was consuming an entire quarter's worth of communication in one morning. She didn't say hello. She said, "What in the hell have you been keeping in the back of that garage?" "Cars," Ethan said. Ethan, I'll explain later. You'll explain now. I have 30 minutes before my shift, he explained. He gave her the version that didn't require knowing the difference between a ZL1 and a standard Camaro, which meant some things got simplified in ways that would have made Robert Ashford wince. But Claire was a nurse, and her patience for automotive specifications was limited. She listened. When he finished, she was quiet for long enough that he checked to see if the call had dropped. "Why didn't you tell me?" she said. "Because it wasn't time yet." "Ethan, that's not... You can't just..." She stopped. He could hear her on the other end of the line, doing the thing she'd always done, which was swallowing her frustration and reorganizing it into something more manageable. "Are you okay?" "Yeah," he said. "Is Lily okay?" "She doesn't know any of this is happening. She thinks everything is normal." "Good," Claire said. "Keep it that way as long as you can." A pause. "Call me when it gets worse, because it's going to get worse before it gets better." She wasn't wrong about that. The article itself was everything Teller had promised and nothing he'd oversold. He had a gift for the kind of writing that laid facts end to end and let the reader reach their own conclusions, which was more devastating than editorializing because it didn't give anyone a target to argue with. The headline was simple. Local mechanic's garage conceals one of the most significant private auto collections in the country. And then the question of why city inspectors came calling. The subheadline was quieter and somehow worse. A timeline of citations and what preceded them. The article ran 3,000 words. It included Ashford's assessment of the collection. Ashford had agreed to be quoted, which lent the piece a credibility that a journalist quoting anonymous sources couldn't have achieved. It included a photograph of the ZL1, shot by the Herald's photographer who'd accompanied Teller on a second visit 2 days prior. It included the timeline that Donahue's records had provided, laid out in a table that made the 72-hour correlation between Victoria's visit and the inspection escalation visible to anyone who could read a calendar. It did not accuse Victoria Hale of anything. It didn't need to. By noon, the story had been picked up by 3 regional outlets. By 3 in the afternoon, it was on 2 national automotive publications and 1 general interest site that covered what it called human interest stories with teeth. By 6 that evening, a television news crew had shown up on Mercer Street and was filming the exterior of the garage while Ethan remained inside and declined to come out, which somehow made better television than if he had. He watched the coverage briefly on his phone in the office while the coffee maker ran. And Lily, who he'd brought to the garage after school because he didn't want her going home to an empty house on a day when he wasn't sure who might be paying attention, did her homework at the small desk in the corner with her headphones in. Unaware that 40 feet away, a camera crew was broadcasting images of her father's life to an audience that was growing by the hour. He turned the phone face down on the desk. The office phone rang. He let it ring. It rang again. He answered it because he'd been letting it ring all day, and his voicemail was probably full by now. "Mr. Cross." The voice on the other end was not Victoria's. It was one of the lawyers, Reeve, the one who'd first extended the business card that Ethan hadn't taken. His voice had lost about 30% of its trained smoothness. "I'm calling on behalf of Ms. Hale to request that you..." "To request what exactly?" Ethan said. Not hostile, genuinely curious about how this sentence was going to end. A pause. "That you refrain from any further communications with the press until we've had an opportunity to speak." "I haven't had any communications with the press today," Ethan said. The article ran. The reporter did his job. "I was here all day fixing cars. Mr. Cross, is there anything else?" A longer pause. "Ms. Hale would like to speak with you. She has my number," Ethan said. "She used it before." He hung up. Lily took out one earbud. "Was that important?" "Not particularly," Ethan said. "Mrs. Patterson says when something's not important, you should just ignore it." "Mrs. Patterson sounds right." Lily put the earbud back in and returned to what appeared to be a worksheet about fractions, which she was approaching with the focused dissatisfaction of someone who had decided fractions were a personal affront. Ethan picked up his coffee. It was cold. He drank it anyway. The camera crew outside packed up around 7. He watched them go from the window, the van pulling away from the curb in the particular way of people who have gotten what they came for and have somewhere else to be. The street was quiet after that, in the way of a street that has been disrupted and is now settling back into itself, not quite the same as before. He locked up the garage, loaded Lily into the car, drove home, made dinner, pasta, because it was a Wednesday and Wednesdays were pasta, and helped Lily through the fraction worksheet, which turned out to be less adversarial once she understood that fractions were just division wearing a different coat. "That's it?" she said. "That's basically it," he said. "Then why do they call it fractions? Division makes more sense." "I genuinely don't know," Ethan said. She went to bed at 8:30 without much argument, which meant she was tired, and Ethan sat at the kitchen table and looked at his phone and the 17 notifications he'd been ignoring and thought about what Claire had said. It's going to get worse before it gets better. He opened the first notification, a message from a number he didn't recognize, an automotive journalist in Los Angeles who wanted to know if he was available for comment. He closed it. The second was from Teller. "Stories moving fast. Call me when you can." He called Teller. 4 national outlets have reached out for follow-up, Teller said. He sounded like someone who runs on adrenaline and was currently running very well. 2 of them want to send their own photographers. 1 wants to do a video piece. Ashford is getting calls too. He told me to tell you he's being discreet, but he can't stay discreet indefinitely. "How long do we have before it becomes something I can't manage?" Ethan asked. "Define manage." "Before Lily knows something is wrong." Teller was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the journalist on adrenaline quality had softened slightly. "I'd say you have a week, maybe 10 days, before it gets loud enough that you have to address it directly. Possibly less if Hale's team does something reactive." "What kind of something?" "Puts out a statement, challenges the timeline, gets aggressive with counter-messaging." A pause. "Or makes you another offer." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. He was sitting at the same kitchen table where he'd read the lawyer's letter in the dark 3 weeks ago, and the drawer with Mara's birthday card was 18 inches from his left hand, which was a fact he was aware of in the particular way you're aware of certain things that don't require you to look at them. "Let them respond however they respond," he said. "I'm not changing anything on my end." "Ethan." Teller's voice had shifted again. Less journalist, more person. They'd known each other for approximately 3 weeks, and had had maybe 6 conversations, which was not long enough for most people to start using first names in that particular tone, but Teller was apparently not most people. "What exactly is it you want out of this? Not the conditions? Not the strategy? What do you actually want?" Ethan thought about it. Outside, a car went by on the street, its headlights briefly touching the kitchen window and sliding away. "I want Mercer Street to have mattered," he said. "Not just to me. To the record. I want it to be documented that something was taken from people who didn't have the resources to fight back, and that someone noticed, and that it cost something." He paused. "That's all." Teller didn't say anything immediately. Ethan could hear him breathing, and somewhere in the background, the sound of whatever Teller's apartment sounded like at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday, which turned out to be the quiet sound of a city outside a window, and a television that wasn't quite loud enough to make out. "Okay," Teller said. "Then let's make sure it's documented." They hung up. Ethan sat for another 20 minutes without moving. Then he went to check on Lily, who was asleep with one arm hanging off the bed and her hair across her face in a way that would give her a headache when she woke up. He moved the hair carefully without waking her, tucked the arm back onto the mattress, stood there for a moment in the doorway. Then he went to sleep himself, because tomorrow there was a 2018 Jeep Wrangler with a transmission problem waiting for him, and that was real, and it needed doing. The calls from Hale Development over the next 3 days had a quality that Ethan recognized from the inspection citations, escalating pressure delivered in the smooth language of legal and professional courtesy. Reeve called twice more. A different lawyer called once, this one a woman with a voice calibrated for arbitration, who floated the phrase reputational remediation without apparently hearing how it sounded. They sent a formal letter by courier, an actual courier, not email, which struck Ethan as both expensive and slightly theatrical, outlining Hale Development's position that the article contained misleading implications, and that they were prepared to demonstrate the legitimacy of all compliance activities to any appropriate regulatory body. Ethan forwarded the letter to Teller. Teller forwarded it to 2 legal analysts he knew. Their assessment appeared 2 days later in the Herald as a sidebar to a follow-up article. The follow-up article included the municipal records. The timeline, now reproduced in full, generated an intensity of public response that was measurable not just in social media volume, but in the more concrete currency of city council attention. 3 council members who had been navigating the Hale development project with the particular evasiveness of elected officials who want to receive credit for progress without being associated with its costs, suddenly became very interested in the compliance activities of the city's inspection department. The head of the department issued a statement that managed to simultaneously defend the process and create distance from any specific decisions, which was not a simple thing to achieve and suggested someone had paid real money for the communications consultant who drafted it. None of this reached Lily directly. It reached the school, which was not exactly nothing. A parent who worked at the Herald had a child in Lily's class, and there was a conversation at pickup that Lily relayed to Ethan with the editorial sense of a 7-year-old who knows something is being talked around. Emma's mom asked me if I was okay, Lily reported on Thursday afternoon, climbing into the back seat with her backpack and the remains of a granola bar. Why would Emma's mom ask me that? Does she think something happened? She's just being nice, Ethan said. But why is she asking me specifically? She doesn't usually talk to me. Ethan found a traffic light that required his full attention. People are nice sometimes for no particular reason, he said. Lily chewed this over along with the granola bar. That's not a real answer, she said. No, he agreed. It's not. I'll tell you more when there's more to tell. She seemed to find this acceptable, which was one of the better qualities she'd developed, a willingness to wait for information she'd been promised without pressing constantly. He didn't know if that was temperament or something she'd learned from him or from the experience of losing her mother before she was old enough to understand what questions to ask. He didn't like thinking about that last possibility too much. It was Friday afternoon when Victoria called. Not through a lawyer this time, her own number, which he still had from the one previous call. He almost didn't answer, then thought about what that would communicate and answered. Mr. Cross. Her voice was different from the last time he'd spoken to her directly. Still controlled. He doubted she often let the control drop all the way. But there was something behind the control that hadn't been there before. Not desperation. More like the particular quality of a chess player who has seen a development on the board they hadn't fully anticipated and is deciding how to respond. Ms. Hale, he said. I'd like to meet with you, she said. In person. Without lawyers this time. Why without lawyers? Because lawyers make conversations into negotiations, and I'd like to talk to you before this becomes any more of a negotiation than it already is. He thought about it. Not long. Same place as before? He asked. The garage? Yes, if that's where you're comfortable. Saturday morning, he said. 10 o'clock. A pause. All right. Come alone, he said. I mean that. I'll come alone. She almost said something else. He could tell by the slight hesitation before the call ended. That quality of a sentence started internally and then reconsidered. He didn't know what it was. He thought about it briefly after hanging up, then went back to the Jeep's transmission, which did not care about any of this and required his hands and his focus and a certain amount of creative language that he used only when Lily wasn't around. Saturday morning, 10 o'clock. Victoria Hale arrived at 9:58, which was either punctuality or the reluctance to appear eager by arriving exactly on time. She was alone, as she'd said. No car service this time. She drove herself. A dark gray sedan that was expensive but not ostentatious, the kind of car that signals wealth without advertising it. She parked on the street rather than in the small lot, which meant she had to walk past the garage sign, the crooked one, his father's, faded at the edges, to reach the entrance. He had coffee made, 2 cups, which was either optimistic or a habit of hospitality that he'd inherited from his father, who believed strongly that you couldn't have a real conversation with someone who didn't have something in their hands. She took the cup. They sat, her on the metal folding chair as before, him on the stool he used at the workbench when he was doing detail work that required sitting. The garage was quieter on Saturday mornings in a specific way, the bays not yet open, the neighborhood not yet fully awake, the light coming in through the high windows at an angle that made everything look slightly more considered than it actually was. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "The timeline article," Victoria said. She didn't finish the sentence. "What about it? Did you have those records before the inspection citation started? Or after?" It was a more intelligent question than most people would have asked in her position. He appreciated that, reluctantly. "I requested them after," he said. "I suspected the connection. The records confirmed it." She nodded. Her coffee cup was in both hands. Her blazer today was a different shade from before, and navy, not black. And she was not wearing the professional armor of the first visit. She looked, he thought, like someone who had not slept particularly well in several days and had given up pretending otherwise. "I want to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to hear it as what it is, which is not a legal strategy and not a negotiation opening." "Okay," he said carefully. "I didn't order the inspections," she said. "I mean that as precisely as it sounds. I did not pick up a phone and call the inspection department and ask them to cite your property. What I did was, I talked to someone in the city's development coordination office, over lunch, which was a lunch that happens regularly and is normal. And I expressed my frustration about this property and the timeline implications. And then, apparently that person made decisions that I did not explicitly request, but that I also did not follow up to prevent." She paused. "That's a meaningful distinction in law. It's not a meaningful distinction in what actually happened." Ethan looked at her. She met his gaze without flinching. "Why are you telling me that?" he said. "Because I'm tired of managing the version of events," she said. "And because—" She stopped, looked at her coffee, looked back up. "Because I went and looked at the Guerrero family's restaurant. The space. It's a parking structure now. 4 levels of concrete with motion sensor lighting. And I stood in it for about 5 minutes, and I thought about what was there before." Something moved across her face, briefly. "I grew up in a neighborhood like this one. Not the same, but the same kind of stakes, the same kind of people." "What happened to it?" he asked. "Development," she said, with a flatness that contained more than one thing. "Someone like me, 20 years before me. We moved." A pause. "It's fine. We were fine. But I remember what it felt like when we drove away." The garage was very quiet. Outside, a bird was doing something complicated in the gutter of the building across the street. "That's not an excuse," she said. "I know that. I'm not offering it as one." "What are you offering it as?" he asked. She set her coffee cup down on the workbench. "Context," she said, "and a question. What do you actually want from this, Ethan? Not from me specifically, from the whole thing." It was the same question Teller had asked. He gave her the same answer, more or less, that he wanted it documented, wanted it on the record, wanted the cost of what had happened to the neighborhood to exist somewhere that couldn't be erased. And then he said something to Victoria that he hadn't said to Teller because it was more relevant here. "I want you to have to live with what it costs to fix it," he said. "Not financially, actually live with it. The decisions, the public acknowledgement, not a statement written by a communications team that expresses concern while admitting nothing. An actual reckoning with what happened." Victoria was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the bird had resolved whatever it was doing in the gutter. The street was starting to come to life, a car, distant voices, the sound of someone's Saturday morning beginning normally, the way most Saturday mornings did. "You could have sold to me," she said. "You still could. You could take the money and open something better in a location that isn't being built around." She wasn't making the offer. She was stating the geography of options. "Most people would have done that by now." "I know," Ethan said. "What makes you different?" He thought about his father at 24 with $600 and his uncle's loan. He thought about Mara writing a birthday card in a hospital bed. He thought about Lily and the accidentally scored goal, the closed eyes, the ball going where it went. "I'm not different," he said. "I just decided what I was keeping, and I kept it." Victoria picked her coffee back up, drank the rest of it, sat with what he'd said in the way of someone who has heard something they need to process before responding, and who has enough self-awareness to know that responding immediately would be the wrong move. "If I agree to your conditions," she said finally. Her voice was careful, precise. "Return of acquired properties to the community trust, withdrawal of all compliance actions, and a public statement that acknowledges harm, not implies it, acknowledges it." She looked at him. My lawyers will have opinions about that last part. I imagine they will, he said. My board will have opinions. Also likely. The development continues, she said. That's not on the table. The building goes up. The project moves forward. The development was never what I was trying to stop, Ethan said. You can build whatever you want to build. I just want the people who lost something in the process to have something real to show for it. Victoria set her empty coffee cup down. She looked around the garage and the pegboard tools, the parts shelf, the board with invoices, Lily's crayon drawing in the corner. She looked at it longer than she'd looked at anything else. The drawing, though she didn't say anything about it. You're a strange man, she said, not unkindly. Probably, he agreed. I need the weekend, she said, to talk to people I need to talk to. That's fair, he said. She stood, picked up her jacket from where she'd draped it over the folding chair. At the door she paused, and he thought she might say something about the drawing, but she didn't. What she said instead surprised him. The prototype, she said, the one Ashford mentioned in the article follow-up, the Crestline. She looked at him. Did you drive it here? When you brought it from Detroit? He nodded once. How did it drive? He thought about the 11 months of engineering, about the specific way the car settled into a highway at 90 miles an hour, the mechanical conversation between body and road that he had designed and built and understood at a level beyond what most people would experience it. The drive from Detroit to this city in a car that wasn't supposed to exist, on a night road in early spring, with Lily asleep in the back seat of his regular truck behind him, driven by Claire, who had not known then exactly what was in the transport trailer ahead, but had known enough to ask no questions. Like something that had been designed to do exactly what it was doing, he said, and nothing else. Victoria nodded slowly. I'll call you Monday, she said. She walked out. He heard her car start, heard it pull away from the curb, heard the particular sound of a car being driven by someone who is thinking hard enough that speed is an afterthought. Then the garage was quiet again, and Ethan picked up his tools and went to work. The weekend passed the way weekends do when you're carrying something you can't put down. The surface of things normal, the weight of things constant. He took Lily to the farmer's market on Sunday because they went most Sundays when the weather was tolerable, and breaking the pattern would have registered with her. She spent 40 minutes evaluating apples with an intensity that he found genuinely endearing, and came home with a bag that was heavier than was strictly reasonable and a small jar of honey that she insisted on carrying herself. He watched her cross the parking lot with the honey held in both hands like something ceremonial, and thought about what Claire had said, about keeping things normal as long as possible. He thought, this is normal. This is the thing worth protecting, not the garage, not the collection, not the legal outcome. This, the honey, the apples, the too heavy bag. He thought, Mara would have liked today. He didn't say it out loud, he just thought it and let it sit with him, the way he'd learned to carry those thoughts, not fought, not indulged, just held alongside everything else. The way you carry something delicate in your pocket that you don't want to break, but that you also refuse to leave behind. Monday morning came gray and cold, the first real cold of the approaching season, and Ethan was in the middle of an oil change on a Subaru that had seen better decades when his phone rang at 11:43, and it was Victoria Hale, and she said 3 sentences. I've spoken to my board and my legal team. The conditions you named are acceptable. I'd like to meet this week to begin formalizing the agreement. Ethan set down the drain plug. He stood in the middle of the bay. He did not feel triumphant. He felt something quieter and more complicated than triumph. The particular sensation of having held a position long enough that the holding of it becomes its own kind of answer. Wednesday works, he said. Here, same as before. Wednesday, she agreed. He put the phone in his pocket and finished the oil change, because the Subaru still needed its oil changed regardless of what had just happened, and the work didn't pause for significance, and his father had never let it, and neither would he. Outside on Mercer Street, the wind picked up, and the sign above the bay doors swung slightly on its bracket. The crooked sign, the faded letters, the Sunday afternoon paint job from 1987, and it held, the way it had always held, slightly wrong and completely certain. The Wednesday meeting was supposed to be straightforward. That was what Ethan told himself driving in that morning, Lily buckled in the back with her water bottle and the chapter book she was halfway through, the heat running in the car because the cold had made up its mind overnight and was now committed. Straightforward. Victoria had agreed to the conditions. They would meet, they would begin formalizing, they would move toward an agreement that meant something real. He dropped Lily at school and watched her go in the same way he always did, through the doors and gone. And then he drove to Mercer Street and opened the bay doors and made coffee and waited. What arrived instead of straightforward was a black SUV, which was not Victoria's gray sedan, and out of it came three people: Reeve the lawyer, the woman lawyer whose name he'd learned was Caldwell, and a man he didn't recognize who carried himself with the specific energy of someone who had been brought in to manage a situation that other people had allowed to get out of hand. He was maybe 50, with the kind of face that looks permanently disappointed but professionally pleasant, and he introduced himself as Warren Briggs, which meant nothing to Ethan until Caldwell mentioned that Warren was Hale Development's chief operating officer, at which point it meant a great deal. "Where's Victoria?" Ethan said. "Ms. Hale sends her regards," Briggs said. "She's been called into an investor meeting that couldn't be rescheduled." "Rescheduled or avoided?" Ethan said. Briggs blinked. It was a small blink, controlled, the blink of a man recalibrating. "I assure you, Mr. Cross, that Warren is fully authorized to represent the company's position and to—" "I was talking to Briggs," Ethan said, looking at Briggs. Briggs looked back at him with the expression of a man who has negotiated with difficult people in difficult rooms for 30 years and is deciding which version of himself to deploy. Then something shifted in the expression, a microscopic adjustment, like a lens clicking into focus. "She's avoiding the optics," Briggs said. "The investors are nervous. Being seen personally negotiating with this situation at this stage raises questions she's not ready to answer publicly." Ethan appreciated the honesty. He didn't appreciate the situation. "Then we're not meeting today," he said. "Mr. Cross, I told her specifically. I'm not doing this through intermediaries. She agreed to meet personally. If that's changed, I need her to call me and tell me that directly." Reeve made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Caldwell was writing something in a notepad that Ethan suspected was entirely for show. Briggs stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at Ethan the way a person looks at a problem they genuinely don't know how to solve. "You understand," Briggs said, "that the longer this drags out, the more pressure builds on both sides." "I know," Ethan said. "I'm comfortable with pressure. I've had practice." Briggs nodded slowly. "I'll relay your position." "Tell her Wednesday still works," Ethan said. "Next Wednesday. Same time. Her, not a representative." They left. The SUV pulled away from the curb in the careful way of expensive vehicles, and Ethan stood in the empty bay and felt the particular irritation of a man who has prepared himself for a conversation that didn't happen. He stood there for about 30 seconds. Then he picked up his tools and went to work on the brake lines of a 2015 Kia that had come in the day before, because the Kia needed brakes, and standing around being irritated accomplished nothing, which was something his father had said approximately 10,000 times, and which he had absorbed completely without ever intending to. He called Teller that afternoon from the office. "They sent the COO," he told him. "Briggs? Warren Briggs is involved now?" Teller's interest sharpened audibly. "That's significant. Briggs doesn't show up to small problems. I sent them away." "Good." A pause. "Also slightly insane, but good. What's your read on why they escalated to Briggs?" "Investor pressure." She used the word herself. The investors are nervous. Of course they are. The story's been picked up by 2 financial publications now. When the press starts writing about a development project in the context of municipal compliance irregularities, money pays attention. Money is very sensitive to the word irregularities. Teller was quiet for a moment. "Here's the thing, Ethan. You know the window on this isn't unlimited. Public attention has a half-life. Right now, everyone's paying attention. In 3 weeks, something else happens, and they're paying attention to that. Whatever you're trying to accomplish, the leverage you have is time-sensitive." "I know," Ethan said. "I'm not telling you to rush. I'm telling you to be aware." "I'm aware." He was. He'd been aware of it since the beginning, Since the moment he'd called Teller and Ashford and set something in motion that had its own momentum now and couldn't be called back. There is a particular kind of awareness that comes from having made an irreversible decision. Not regret, not exactly, but a heightened attention to consequences, to the shape of what you've started and how it wants to end. Victoria called Thursday morning early. He was still in the kitchen, Lily not yet awake. The house in the specific quiet of 6:15 on a school day when the whole building still felt like it was sleeping. "I owe you an apology," she said. No preamble. "Wednesday was wrong." "Yes," he said. "Warren isn't... He's competent. He's not me. I understand why that matters to you." "Do you?" A pause. "You don't trust intermediaries in this kind of conversation because intermediaries optimize for outcome, not for honesty. And you're not primarily interested in the outcome." Ethan was quiet for a moment, slightly surprised, though perhaps he shouldn't have been. She was not an unintelligent person. She had gotten to where she was partly through money and network and timing, but also through the ability to read people and situations with clarity, and she was reading him now the way she probably read most things. Directly, without the softening filter of what she wanted to be true. "Wednesday," he said. "Next week. Come alone." "I'll be there," she said. And she was. She arrived at 9:55, the gray sedan, the dark coat, a thermos of her own coffee because, and she said this at the door, slightly awkwardly, which surprised him because awkwardness seemed like something she'd engineered out of herself years ago, because she hadn't wanted to impose on his again, but she also runs on caffeine, and the meeting felt important enough not to approach decaffeinated. He almost smiled. He pointed at the folding chair. She sat. For the next 2 hours, they worked through the conditions. The return of acquired properties was the first, and it was, structurally, the most complicated. Hale Development had purchased 12 properties along the Mercer corridor over the preceding 4 years. Several of those purchases had been from families directly, transactions that were legally clean but whose circumstances were now, in the light of public scrutiny, uncomfortable enough that reviewing them was preferable to defending them. 3 of the 12 properties had already been demolished. The land could still be returned to community trust, which was not the same as returning the buildings, which was not the same as returning the families, which was the actual loss and was not fully correctable. Ethan knew this. He said it out loud because he thought it needed to be said out loud, and heard by someone who had the power to at least approximate the correction. "You can't give them back what they lost," he said. "The Guerreros lost 22 years of a business. Mrs. Callahan lost a space she'd had since 1998. Those things aren't in the land, they're in time. You can't return that." Victoria had her thermos and was looking at the list of addresses they'd been working from. She didn't look up when she answered. "I know. But the land matters because it's something real and durable that they can use, or their kids can use, or the community organization can use to build something that serves them instead of me." "I understand," she said. "Do you want to, though?" He said it without malice. It was a real question, because understanding it intellectually and actually wanting to do it are different things. "I need to know which one this is." She looked up then. Her expression was one he hadn't seen from her before. Not the strategic calculation of their first meeting, not the worn quality of the Monday call. This was something more raw and less managed, and he thought it was probably closer to what she actually looked like when there was no one in the room she needed to manage. "When I was 14, she said, "we moved because the landlord sold the building. We had 3 weeks. We moved to my aunt's house across town, which was a different school district, which meant I left the school I'd been at for 6 years. I didn't get to say goodbye to most of my friends because 14-year-olds don't handle transitions gracefully, and I was angry at everyone, including the people who had nothing to do with it." She looked back at the list. "I'm not trying to claim that as suffering that compares to what happened here. It doesn't. But I remember what it felt like to have no say in something that mattered enormously to you, and I remember who held the power in that situation." A pause. "I became the person who holds the power, and for a long time that felt like the only reasonable response to having been the other one." The garage was very quiet. Somewhere in the street, a delivery truck was idling, its engine a low, irregular heartbeat. "That makes sense," Ethan said, "and it's not enough justification." "No," she agreed. It's not. But it's real, he said. And I'd rather have the real version than the one where you tell me you've always been committed to community development. For the first time in any of their meetings, Victoria Hale did something that looked, from the outside, like the beginning of an actual laugh. It didn't fully arrive. It stopped at the threshold, a brief unlocking of something she kept pretty tightly locked. But it was there. The community statement language is going to be a fight with Caldwell, she said, returning to the list. She's going to want something that acknowledges impact without acknowledging conduct. That won't work, Ethan said. I know that won't work. I'm telling you, it's going to be a fight, and I'm going to have it. Why? She looked at him. Because you were right. About the record. About it needing to exist in a form that can't be managed into something else. She tapped the list with one finger. And because I'm tired. I have been doing this. The management of versions, the legal positioning, I'm tired of it. It takes a lot of energy to maintain a reality that isn't entirely true, and I've been expending that energy for years, and I'm not sure what I've been building toward. He didn't say anything. He'd learned over the course of these conversations that Victoria Hale said more useful things when he didn't fill her silences. My mother called me after the article ran, she said. The first one. She saw it because her neighbor sent it to her. She called and she asked me. Victoria stopped, picked up her thermos, put it back down without drinking. She asked me if I was the person in the article. I told her yes. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said, Victoria, I hope you fix it. She didn't ask for an explanation. She didn't want to hear the strategy. She just said, fix it. Like it was obvious what fixing it meant, and the only question was whether I was going to. Are you? He asked. I'm sitting in your garage at 10 in the morning working through a list of properties, she said. What do you think? What he thought was complicated, what he felt was simpler. He felt, for the first time since any of this had started, that the person across from him was not the billionaire developer who had driven past his garage and seen an obstacle. She was a person who had run very fast in one direction for a very long time and had arrived somewhere she needed to reconsider. He didn't say any of that. What he said was, let's talk about the compliance withdrawal. The compliance withdrawal was procedurally simpler than the property question and politically more delicate because it required the city's inspection department to formally close the citation process and acknowledge that the escalation had been inappropriate, which was the kind of thing that moved through municipal bureaucracy at the speed of something that did not want to move at all. Victoria had contacts, Ethan had Donahue's records. Together they mapped out what pressure points existed and which of them were applicable here. This was the part of the morning that felt most like the engineering problems Ethan used to solve, not because it was similar in content, but because it had the same structure. A system with multiple variables, some fixed and some adjustable, and the goal of finding the configuration that produced the desired output without generating new problems elsewhere. He'd always been good at that kind of thinking. It came back to him easily, like a language he'd stopped speaking but hadn't forgotten. You can petition the oversight board directly, he said, reading through the notes he'd made from his call with Donahue. The records I have establish the timeline. If the petition is accompanied by the records and teller's documentation, the board has grounds to review the assignment history without having to admit that anything improper happened. They can close the citations as part of a general compliance review. That gives them cover, Victoria said. She didn't sound happy about it. It gives them a way to do the right thing without requiring them to eat glass to do it, Ethan said. If we make it impossible for them to correct without humiliating themselves, they won't correct. They'll dig in. Victoria was looking at him with an expression that was hard to read, something between respect and mild exasperation. You think like a systems person, she said. I am a systems person, he said. I know. I read everything about the Hartwell spectra after the follow-up article. He hadn't known that. He wasn't sure how he felt about it. And you were 26 when you co-led that design, she said, and you walked away from a career that most people don't walk away from that, not voluntarily. I had reasons. I know your reasons, she said. The article mentioned your wife. A pause. I'm sorry. I don't have anything more useful to say about it than that. That's fine, Ethan said. It's enough. They sat with that for a moment, not awkwardly, not in the forced solemnity of people performing grief respect, but in the natural quiet of two people who have touched something real and don't want to rush past it. Then Ethan said, "There's one more thing I want to add to the conditions. It's not on the original list." Victoria set her thermos down. "All right. The community properties, when they go into trust, I want a local board to govern the trust. Not a city board, not a development company board. People from the neighborhood, families who were here before the redevelopment started." He looked at her. "And I want a guaranteed operational budget for 5 years. Not charity, an endowment, something that doesn't depend on quarterly corporate goodwill to function." The silence that followed was longer than the others. He could see her running numbers, not visibly, but in the particular quality of her attention, the way someone's eyes go slightly unfocused when they're doing internal calculations. "That's a significant additional commitment," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "You're asking for a functioning institution, not a gesture." "Gestures expire," he said. "I want something that still exists in 20 years. Another pause. Outside, the delivery truck had finally moved on and the street was quieter. The light through the high windows had shifted with the mid-morning movement of the sun, and the garage had a different quality than it had at 10, warmer, less austere. "What's the minimum viable endowment for 5 years of operations?" she asked. And the question itself, the way she framed it, minimum viable, operational, told him she was not rejecting the idea. She was pricing it. "I don't know exactly," he said honestly. "I'd need to talk to people who run community trusts. Teller has contacts. Set up that conversation," she said. "This week, if possible." "Okay," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "You've thought about every piece of this, haven't you? Not just the pressure points, not just the legal leverage. You've thought about what it needs to look like after. What has to be in place for it to actually mean something?" "I've had some time," he said. "You've had 7 weeks of city inspectors and lawyers and a media story that could have gone several different directions," she said. "Most people would have spent that time being frightened." "I was frightened," he said. "I just didn't let it be the main thing." She nodded. Then she gathered the notes they'd made, her handwriting on a yellow legal pad, his on the back of an invoice sheet because that was what had been within reach, and put them in her bag with the careful attention of someone preserving something that matters. At the door she paused, as she always seemed to. The October sun was doing something complicated outside, coming through a gap in the clouds at an angle that made Mercer Street look, briefly, like a different street than it was. Warmer, more golden, the faded sign above the bay casting a shadow at a new angle. "The drawing," she said. "The one in the corner of the office." He waited. "Is that your daughter's?" "Yeah," he said. "How old?" 7. Victoria looked at the drawing for another moment. Lily's crayon version of the garage. The big yellow sun that 7-year-olds put in every picture regardless of whether it belongs there. The figure labeled Daddy with a wrench in his too large hand. "She got the sign right," Victoria said. "The crooked one." Ethan looked at the drawing. He hadn't noticed that before. Lily had drawn the sign crooked. Slightly, imprecisely, the way the real one was. Not dramatically tilted, just a few degrees off level, the way things get when they've been a certain way for long enough that nobody thinks to correct them. "Yeah," he said. She did. Victoria left. He stood in the bay after she was gone and looked at the drawing for a while. Lily had drawn it 8 months ago, on a rainy Saturday when she'd been bored, and he'd given her crayons and a blank sheet of paper, and she had produced, in the unself-conscious way of a child who has spent a lot of time in a specific place, an accurate record of it. The sign crooked, the bay doors the right proportion, even the 2 tire stacks on the left wall rendered in hasty circles. He took the drawing down from the board carefully, holding the corners, and looked at it in his hands. Then he put it back up, precisely where it had been. The following days moved with the compressed, dense quality of things that are moving toward a conclusion. Teller connected Ethan with a woman named Rosario Vega, who ran a community land trust in another part of the city and had been doing it successfully for 11 years. Rosario was small, direct, and had opinions about governance structures that she expressed with the precision of someone who had seen every possible way for a community institution to fail and had spent a decade designing around each one. She and Ethan had coffee in the garage office on a Thursday afternoon, Rosario looking around the space with the assessing gaze of someone who had spent her career working in underfunded places and could read a room's resource history from the furniture. And she walked him through what a 5-year endowment actually needed to accomplish, and what governance structures actually held up under pressure versus which ones looked good on paper and collapsed when someone with money got uncomfortable. The board composition is everything, she said. If you let money name more than 30% of the board seats, you'll lose the institution in 7 years, maybe 8. The money finds ways to be majority even when it's technically not. She's already agreed to a local board, Ethan said. Agreed in what form? Rosario asked. Verbal agreement in a garage is one thing. What's in the document? Nothing in a document yet, he said. Okay. Then my first recommendation is get it in the document before you close anything. She looked at him over her coffee. I don't know this Hale person, but I know the type, and the type doesn't always remember informal commitments the same way you do. She's been straight with me, he said. Good. Keep her straight with the document. He passed this to Victoria. She passed it to her legal team. Caldwell produced a first draft of the trust governance language that Rosario called technically compliant and practically useless. Ethan sent this back to Victoria verbatim because he thought she should have the exact words and make her own judgment. Victoria apparently agreed with Rosario because she called Caldwell and they had a conversation that Ethan was not party to, but which resulted 2 days later in a second draft that Rosario described as something you could actually build on. Progress. Imperfect, frustrating, real. It was during this period, the long middle section of negotiations where each day produced small forward movement and occasional backward movement and required constant attention, that Ethan began to understand something about Victoria Hale that hadn't been visible in their earlier meetings. She had a quality that he recognized because he had it too, in different form. The ability to hold a position past the point where most people would have found a way to rationalize letting go of it. When her lawyers pushed for softened language, she held. When her board expressed concern about the endowment commitment, she held. When a financial press outlet ran a piece suggesting that the concessions indicated weakness that would affect investor confidence in future projects, she put out a brief personal statement, not drafted by the communications team, which was evident from the lack of corporate polish, that said, essentially, that building things that last requires understanding what you're building on, and that she was in the process of doing exactly that. Teller sent Ethan the statement with a one-line message. She wrote that herself. Ethan read it twice. Then he put his phone in his pocket and went back to work. Gerald Chevelle was done. Had been done for 2 weeks. But Gerald kept coming in anyway, on the pretense of various minor concerns that Ethan suspected were mostly manufactured, and they had developed a pattern of afternoon visits that involved more conversation than was strictly necessary for an automobile in excellent condition. Gerald came in on a Friday afternoon during the second week of negotiations, sat on the parts shelf the way he always did, and said, "How's the rich lady?" "Complicated," Ethan said. "All rich people are complicated," Gerald said. "Or maybe they're simple and the money is complicated. I've never been sure which." "She's honoring the conditions," Ethan said, "more than the minimum. The endowment was her idea to expand, not mine." Gerald considered this. He was 71 and had a face that had seen enough of life to be appropriately skeptical of it without being bitter, which was a balance Ethan admired. People can surprise you when you give them the right problem. What does that mean? Means most people are doing what the situation they're in makes logical sense to do. Change the situation, you sometimes change the person. Gerald looked at the Chevelle, which was gleaming in the bay, in a way that suited Gerald, even though he would never say so directly. "Your father used to say that. About engines. About people too, I think." Ethan looked at the Chevelle. "He say that about anything specific?" "About you once," Gerald said. "When you went to Detroit. He said you were doing what the situation made sense to do. He didn't mean it as criticism. He was proud of you. He just understood that you needed a different problem than Mercer Street at that point." A pause. "And then you came back." "The situation changed," Ethan said. "Yeah," Gerald said. "It did." They sat with that for a while. Gerald on the parts shelf, Ethan leaning against the Chevelle. The afternoon light coming through the bay doors at the low angle of late October, and somewhere outside the neighborhood doing what it did in the late afternoon, the particular sounds of a Friday in a place that was still figuring out what it was becoming. "She gonna come through?" Gerald asked. "The developer, for real." "I think so," Ethan said. "You trust her?" Ethan thought about it honestly. "I trust the conditions," he said. "They're specific enough that she can't pretend to honor them without actually honoring them." "That's not the same as trusting her." "No," he agreed. "It's not, but it's enough for the purposes of the agreement." Gerald nodded, in the way of someone who has thought about the difference between sufficient trust and complete trust for most of his adult life, and has made a separate peace with it. "All right," he said. "I'm going to take the car home." "She's ready," Ethan said. "She's been ready for 2 weeks." "Yeah, I wasn't going to push you." Gerald stood, picked up his keys from the bench where he'd set them, ran his hand along the Chevelle's hood one more time. "You know what it's worth now? The restoration?" "More than you paid for it," Ethan said. "More than I paid for a lot of things," Gerald said. "Some things appreciate if you're patient." He looked at Ethan with the particular directness of a 71-year-old who has decided to be clear. "You going to be okay when this is done? The legal stuff, the story. When it settles and it's just you and the garage again." Ethan had thought about this. "Yeah," he said. "Not lonely?" "Probably sometimes," he said honestly, "but that's not new." Gerald put his keys in his pocket. "Your father was lonely sometimes," he said, "after your mother left. He didn't show it to you because you were 8 and it wasn't your job to carry it, but he was. He used to work late and I'd come by sometimes and he'd be in here and we'd sit and not say a whole lot and that was enough." He paused. "That offer stands. If you want company that doesn't need much from you." Ethan felt something move in his chest. Not painfully, just the particular ache of being seen clearly by someone who has been paying attention for a long time. "Thank you, Gerald," he said. "Don't make it a thing," Gerald said. "Help me back this out." He helped Gerald back the Chevelle out of the bay and into the late afternoon, and the car moved into the street the way restored things move when they're ready, with a kind of settled certainty, the mechanical song of an engine that has been properly attended to and knows it. Gerald waved once without looking back and drove away down Mercer Street, and Ethan stood in the bay entrance and watched him go. The negotiations took 9 more days. The agreement, when it finally existed as a document, was 43 pages, which was 20 pages longer than Caldwell had initially projected, and which contained, on page 31, the governance language that Rosario Vega had said was something you could actually build on. Ethan read all 43 pages. It took him 2 evenings, after Lily was in bed, at the kitchen table under the lamp that buzzed slightly when the weather was cold. He read slowly, the way his father had read important documents, with a pencil in hand for anything that needed marking, and he marked 3 things that he then called Victoria about the following morning. 2 of the 3 she agreed to change. The 3rd she pushed back on, explaining why the language, while imperfect, was the most the board would approve without the whole structure collapsing. Ethan understood her reasoning. He accepted the compromise because it was a real compromise, the kind where both sides give something and both sides get something, rather than the kind where one side calls a retreat, a strategic repositioning. On a Monday morning, 3 days before the end of October, they signed. Not in a boardroom, not in a lawyer's office. Ethan had suggested the garage, expecting resistance, and Victoria had agreed without discussion. They sat at the workbench, the actual workbench, which Ethan had cleared and wiped down, but not transformed into something it wasn't, so there was still a faint oil ring near the left edge from a container he'd set there a week ago, and Reeve and Teller both present as witnesses. Teller had his notebook. He always had his notebook. Victoria signed first. She had a specific way of signing, not the hasty executive scrawl of someone who signs hundreds of documents and doesn't look at them, but a deliberate signature, each letter visible, as if she still thought of her name as something worth the time it took to write completely. Then she passed the document across the workbench to Ethan. He picked up the pen she'd set down. He looked at the document for a moment, all 43 pages of it, the thing they had built together across 2 months of arguments and coffee and difficult conversations, and the specific work of trying to correct something that couldn't be fully corrected but could, at least, be honestly acknowledged. He signed. The pen made the small, dry sound of ink on paper. Then the garage was quiet, and outside on Mercer Street, the October wind moved through the space between the buildings the way wind does in the fall, carrying leaves from somewhere else, passing through and gone. The ink dried and nobody said anything for a moment, which was appropriate because some things don't have an obvious sound that follows them. Reeves stacked the copies with the particular efficiency of a lawyer who has been present for many signings and understands that his job in this moment is purely mechanical. Teller wrote something in his notebook, which Ethan noticed without asking about. Victoria capped the pen and set it on the workbench and looked around the garage the way she'd done on that first visit, except that this time the looking had a different quality. Not assessment, not calculation. More like someone taking a photograph with their eyes, preserving the particular reality of a place at a specific moment before it becomes memory. "Well," Reeves said, because someone had to say something, and it was apparently going to be him. "Thank you, Daniel," Victoria said, and there was a tone in it that politely ended his involvement in whatever this moment was. Reeve picked up his copies, nodded at the room generally, and left. The bay door swung shut behind him with a sound that was not quite a slam, just the firm closure of a heavy thing. Teller looked up from his notebook. He had the expression of a man who is aware that he is present at something and is actively deciding how much of a journalist to be about it. He settled on, "I'm going to step outside and make a call. Take your time." Then he too was gone, and the garage was just the two of them and the workbench with its faint oil ring and the copies of the 43-page agreement and the sound of the street outside doing what streets do on a Monday morning. "That's it then," Ethan said. "Not quite," Victoria said. "The city board still has to formally close the citations. The properties still have to be transferred. The statement still has to be released." She paused. "But the part that depended on us is done." "The part that depended on you," he said. "I was just holding a position." She made a sound that was neither agreement nor disagreement. Then she said something he hadn't expected. "I'm going to need your help with the statement." He looked at her. "That wasn't part of the conditions." "I know. I'm asking anyway." She had both hands flat on the workbench, looking at them rather than at him, which was slightly unusual for someone who generally made eye contact with the practiced ease of a person accustomed to controlling rooms. Caldwell drafted 4 versions. All 4 of them. I read them, and they're technically accurate, and they're also somehow, in a way I can't fully articulate, not what I want to say. They're what I would say if I were managing this. And I told you, I'm tired of managing. She looked up. "You know what this situation is, better than anyone except the people who lived it. What should the statement actually say?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. Outside, a car went past on Mercer Street, its tires on the slightly uneven pavement making the particular sound of this specific street, the sound he'd been hearing his entire life. "It should say that the process hurt people," he said. "Not that the process had unintended consequences, not that certain outcomes fell outside projected parameters, that it hurt people who deserved better, and that the company is committing to specific, measurable actions, not principles, not values, actual actions, because acknowledging harm without correction is just a press release." Victoria nodded slowly. "And the tone? Don't make it about you," he said. "That's the main thing. Every corporate statement about harm ends up, somehow, centering the company's journey and growth and learnings. Nobody wants to hear about your learning. They want to hear that you saw what happened and you're not pretending it was something else." She took out her phone and typed something, not a long something, just a few lines, her thumbs moving at the particular speed of someone capturing a thought before it changes shape. Then she put the phone away. "I'll write it myself," she said. "Caldwell will hate it." "Probably," he agreed. "She'll say it exposes us." "To what?" "You've already signed a 43-page agreement with the exposure built in." "To the perception that we've admitted fault." "You have admitted fault," he said. "That was the point." Victoria picked up the copy of the agreement, held it for a moment, then set it back down. "I know that," she said. "I'm telling you what Caldwell will say so you understand what I'm going to have to hold against." A pause. "It'll come out right. I just wanted you to know it won't be easy." "Nothing about this has been easy," Ethan said. "No," she said. "It hasn't." She picked up her bag, the same efficient motion as always, but something in it had changed from the first time he'd seen her do it. Less armoring, more departure. "For what it's worth," she said at the door, "I'm glad you didn't sell. In the beginning, I wish I'd understood it earlier, but I'm glad the outcome was what it was." Ethan looked at her. "That's a complicated thing to be glad about," he said, "given what it cost." "Yes," she said simply. "It is." She left. He stood in the garage with the signed copies of the agreement and the workbench and the faint oil ring, and let the silence of the space settle back into its normal configuration. Then he unlocked the steel door in the back, went into the climate-controlled room, and stood among the cars for a while without turning on all the lights. Just the ambient glow, the silver gray of the prototype in its corner, the dark shapes of the others arranged around it. His father had never seen this room. He'd died in the summer, before Ethan had begun the construction, before the cars had come. This was something Ethan tried not to think about too directly, because it opened a particular kind of grief that didn't have a clean bottom. The grief of wanting to show someone something they never got to see. The grief of a completed thing that the most important witness wasn't there for. He stood in the room for about 10 minutes. Then he turned the lights off and locked the door, and went to call Lily's school because he'd forgotten to fill out a field trip permission form that was due today, and there was a slightly exasperated voicemail from the school secretary that he needed to address before he did anything else. Some things don't pause for significance. He was glad of it. Teller's follow-up story ran the day after the signing. He'd held it pending confirmation that the agreement was finalized, and now it ran with the headline that was quieter than the first one, but in many ways hit harder. Agreement reached, and what it actually requires. The piece detailed the conditions in specific language, which was intentional. Teller had understood, without being told, that vague reporting of vague commitments was the mechanism by which those commitments later became negotiable. By naming the properties, naming the endowment figure, naming the governance structure, naming the statement requirement, he had made the agreement visible in a way that meant walking it back would itself be a story. The response to that article was different from the first one, less explosive. No viral sharing, no television crews on Mercer Street. But the quality of the response was more substantive. Letters appeared in the Herald from former residents of the corridor. One of them was from Carmen Guerrero, the daughter of the family who had run the restaurant, who wrote 3 paragraphs that were, in Teller's words when he sent Ethan the link, the best 3 paragraphs I've published in the last 5 years, and I didn't write them. Ethan read them at the kitchen table. Carmen Guerrero wrote about her parents counting receipts every night at the table in the back of the restaurant, and about her father's handwriting on the specials board, and about the particular smell of the kitchen on Sunday mornings when her mother made the stock that would last the week. She wrote about the check they received and the 3 weeks they had to clear out, and the way her father had stood in the empty restaurant on the last day, not crying exactly, because he was not a man who cried easily, but not quite not crying either. And then, at the end, in a register that shifted from memory to something more current, she wrote that she had read about the trust and the board and the endowment, and that she would believe it when she saw it, which was a reasonable position, and that she was applying to serve on the board, which was also a reasonable position. And the last line was, "My father built something that mattered on that street. I plan to build something there, too." Ethan folded his laptop closed and sat with that for a while. The endowment figure that appeared in Teller's piece, $800,000 5-year operational budget for the Community Land Trust, had come after a negotiation within the negotiation that had consumed 4 days and 2 conference calls and one genuinely tense exchange between Ethan and Victoria in which neither of them had raised their voice, but the garage had felt approximately 10 degrees colder. The original number Hale Development's finance team had proposed was $400,000, which Rosario Vega had described as enough to rent an office and disappear. Ethan had come back with $1.2 million, which Victoria had described as a number my board would use to end this conversation. They had arrived at 800 through the specific arithmetic of two people who both wanted a real outcome and understood that real outcomes have real costs. 800 is enough to function, Rosario had confirmed when Ethan called her. Not comfortably, but if Carmen Guerrero ends up on that board, she'll make 800 do the work of $1 million too. Some people are built that way. He hadn't told Rosario about Carmen's letter at that point. He told her now, over the phone, reading her the last line. There was a pause on Rosario's end. "Good," she said. "Good." And the repetition of the word was not redundancy, but emphasis, the way you say a thing twice when once doesn't feel sufficient. The city's formal closure of the compliance citations came on a Thursday, 11 days after the signing, through the oversight board process that Ethan had mapped out in that second meeting with Victoria. The board released a 3-paragraph statement describing a comprehensive review of the assignment process, identifying procedural inconsistencies, and formally closing all pending citations against the property at 447 Mercer Street. It did not name any individuals. It did not use the word improper. It used the phrase "fell outside established protocol," which was bureaucratic language for the same thing and would have to serve. Marcus Donahue sent Ethan a text that said, "Only done." Ethan replied, "Thank you." Donahue sent back a thumbs up emoji, which was the appropriate level of ceremony for that particular exchange. The public statement from Hale Development ran the following Monday, which was, Ethan would later learn, the day Caldwell had told Victoria was the worst possible day from a news cycle management perspective, and which Victoria had chosen for precisely that reason. She did not want the statement to disappear into a slow news Friday. She wanted it seen. He read it on his phone while the coffee brewed in the morning, Lily still asleep upstairs, the house in its early quiet. It was 8 paragraphs. It did not begin with "Hale Development Group is committed to," or "as a company, we believe," or any of the standard corporate statement openings that signal immediately that what follows has been through 6 rounds of legal review. It began, "What happened on Mercer Street caused harm to people who did not deserve it. I want to say that directly before saying anything else." Ethan read it twice. Then he put his phone down and poured his coffee and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the early November morning, the trees stripped down to their structures, the particular bare-bones honesty of trees in November when there's nothing left to soften the outline of what they actually are. The statement was not perfect. Paragraph 4 got slightly abstract in a way that probably reflected Caldwell's surviving influence. The phrase "going forward" appeared once, which was one time too many. But the first paragraph was real, and the last paragraph, which named the trust, named the board structure, named the endowment, and invited Carmen Guerrero and others to apply for governance positions by a specific date, was as real as agreements get. Claire called at 8:15. "I just read it," she said. "Yeah," he said. "She wrote that herself, didn't she?" "Parts of it." "The first paragraph," Claire said. "That's not corporate." "No," he agreed. A pause. "How do you feel?" Claire asked. Not the casual, "How do you feel?" of normal conversation. The actual question. He thought about it. Standing at the kitchen window with his coffee, the November trees outside, the house quiet above him, where Lily was still sleeping. How did he feel? "Tired," he said, and like something finished that needed to finish. "Not happy?" "Not in the way I expected to be happy," he said. "More like relieved and sad about the parts that couldn't be fixed, and glad the parts that could be fixed are fixed." He paused. "It's a lot of feelings in a space that doesn't really hold them all neatly." "That's life," Claire said. "I know. Are you going to be okay?" "Yeah," he said. "I'm going to be okay." After he hung up, he heard Lily on the stairs, the particular sound of her descent, which was never cautious and always slightly too fast, the sound of a person who hasn't yet learned to treat staircases with appropriate respect. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas, hair in a configuration that suggested she had been sleeping face down, looking approximately as awake as she would be for another 20 minutes. "Is there cereal?" she said. "There's cereal," he said. She climbed onto her chair and he poured the cereal and the milk, and she ate it with the focused inward attention of someone who has not yet fully returned from wherever sleep takes you. He sat across from her with his coffee and watched her, and she looked up once and said, "Why are you looking at me?" And he said, "Just glad you're here." And she looked at him for a moment with the specific expression of a 7-year-old evaluating whether this requires further investigation, and then apparently decided it didn't and went back to her cereal. He drove her to school. She had forgotten a library book and they had to go back for it, which made them 2 minutes late, which she handled with the disproportionate anxiety of a child for whom being late to anything feels like a moral failing. He told her 2 minutes was nothing. She did not fully believe him, but accepted it because the book was in her bag and there was nothing else to be done. He watched her go in through the doors. Then he drove back to Mercer Street. What he found when he got there was not something he'd been prepared for, which was itself strange because he'd thought he'd anticipated most things. There were flowers at the base of the garage exterior wall. Not a large arrangement, maybe a dozen individual bunches, the kind you buy from a grocery store, wrapped in that thin plastic that doesn't pretend to be anything other than grocery store flowers. Some were fresh. Some had clearly been there since the day before. There was a handwritten note tucked between 2 of the bunches, on a piece of paper that had gotten damp from the morning and was slightly blurred, that said, "Thank you for not leaving." He stood in front of his garage on Mercer Street in the November cold and looked at the flowers for a long moment. He was not a man who cried easily, like Carmen Guerrero's father, and he did not cry now, but something happened in his chest that occupied the same territory and required the same deep breath to manage. He went inside. He opened the bay doors. He made coffee. He turned on the lights in the first bay, which flickered for exactly 2 seconds, the way they always did. He got to work. The first week after the statement was a strange kind of decompression. The pressure that had been constant since Victoria's first visit, the lawyer's letters, the inspectors, the public story, the negotiations, had lifted, and the space it left behind was not exactly comfortable. Pressure, when it is present long enough, becomes a kind of structure. When it goes, you notice its absence the way you'd notice a sound that had been running in the background of your life suddenly stopping. The silence is not peaceful at first. It's just different. Ethan noticed it in small ways. He found himself checking his phone for messages that weren't there. He caught himself working out responses to arguments that were no longer happening. He woke up at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday, convinced there was something he'd forgotten to do, and lay there for 40 minutes cataloging every loose thread before accepting that there were no loose threads, that the thing was done, and that his nervous system had simply not received that memo yet. Gerald came by on a Tuesday. Not to check on the Chevelle this time, no pretext. He just came and sat on the parts shelf, and they talked about football for 20 minutes, which was not a thing either of them particularly cared about, but was a language of normal that the moment seemed to require. "You seem off," Gerald said eventually. "I'm adjusting," Ethan said. "To what?" "To it being over." Gerald nodded. "That's the hardest part of most things," he said. "Not the middle. The after." He looked around the garage at the open bays and the morning light and the ordinary reality of a working space doing what it does. "Your father went through something similar when he paid off the building loan, 1999. He'd been working against that debt for 12 years, and when it was gone, he didn't know what to do with himself for about a month, kept finding new problems to worry about." A pause. "Then he repainted the sign and put it back up crooked and seemed to feel better." Ethan looked at the sign through the bay doors, his father's sign. Still crooked, still faded. "He repainted it," he said. "Put up a fresh version," Gerald said. "Same design, same letters, same angle, about 3 degrees off level. I asked him why he didn't just make it straight while he had the chance, and he said because straight wasn't what it was." Gerald smiled, which was something he did sparingly, and therefore meaningfully. "He meant you, I think. You were about 6, crooked in all the right ways." Ethan looked at the sign for another moment. Then he picked up his socket wrench and went back to the alternator he'd been working on. "I'll come by Friday," Gerald said. "Bring the car. There's a sound." "There's no sound," Ethan said. "There might be a sound," Gerald said. "There's no sound, Gerald." "I'll come by Friday," Gerald said, and left. The formal establishment of the Mercer Street Community Land Trust happened on a Thursday morning in mid-November, in a meeting room at the city's nonprofit registry office that smelled like carpet cleaner and institutional coffee, and had a window overlooking a parking structure that was itself built on land that had once held a family-run printing shop. The small ironies of the city's development were always visible if you knew where to look. Ethan was there. Rosario Vega was there. A representative from Hale Development's legal team was there. Not Caldwell, but a younger associate who kept his expressions professionally neutral and said little. And Carmen Guerrero was there. He recognized her before the introductions. She was 32 or 33, dark-haired, with her father's eyes. He hadn't known her father personally, but he'd seen the restaurant and the people who came in and out, and there was a quality in her attention, the way she looked at things fully before responding, that felt like something inherited. They shook hands. Her grip was firm, without performing firmness. "I read your letter," he said. "In the Herald." "I read yours," she said. "The conditions. Before the letter, I mean. When it was in the follow-up article." A pause. "The endowment board governance structure. The 30% cap on appointed seats. That was yours?" "From Rosario," he said. "I just passed it through." Carmen looked at Rosario, who was standing by the coffee machine looking at it with mild suspicion. "Smart," she said. "She's been doing this longer than either of us," Ethan said. "I'm going to want to talk to her. A lot." Carmen looked around the conference room with an assessment that was thorough and unsentimental. This isn't going to be easy. The trust, the governance, getting people to trust an institution that's funded by the developer who displaced them. She said it plainly, not accusingly, the way you state a fact that needs to be on the table. There's going to be people in the community who think this whole thing is window dressing, and they have reason to think that. "Yes," Ethan said. "So what do you say to them?" He thought about it. "You show them Carmen's letter," he said. "You show them the governance documents. You show them the 30% cap and the elected board positions and the specific uses the endowment can and can't be directed to. And then you tell them they're right to be skeptical, and you prove them wrong over time. And if they want to come to board meetings and ask hard questions, that's exactly what the structure is designed to accommodate." Carmen was quiet for a moment. "You're not going to be on the board?" she said. "No," he said. "I'm not from this community in the way that matters for governance. I grew up on Mercer Street. But I wasn't one of the people who got displaced. I stayed. This isn't mine to run." She looked at him with an expression that was not exactly surprise, but was something adjacent. A reassessment, maybe, of what she'd expected him to be. "You're smarter than the article made you sound," she said, which was as close to a compliment as Ethan suspected Carmen Guerrero offered to people she'd just met. "The article was good," he said. "The article was about the cars," she said, "which is fine. People click on cars." She looked at the window, at the parking structure beyond it. "I'm going to build something on that land that my parents would recognize," she said. "Not the restaurant. Something new, but made from the same material." "I know," Ethan said. "You don't know that," she said. "I might fail." "You might," he agreed, "but I don't think so." She considered this, apparently decided not to argue with it. The meeting was starting, Rosario calling people to the table with the direct efficiency of someone who understood that the work didn't pause for conversations, even important ones. The paperwork took 2 hours. It was boring in the way that all important legal paperwork is boring. The reading of language, the initialing of pages, the signatures in specific places for specific reasons. Ethan sat through it and signed where indicated and watched Carmen Guerrero sign with the same deliberateness he'd noticed in Victoria. People who understood that their signature meant something they'd have to live with. Afterward, in the parking lot, Carmen said, "What happens to the garage now?" "Same thing it's always done," he said. "I fix cars." She looked at him with a directness that reminded him of Teller, of Rosario, of the specific quality of people who have learned to see situations whole rather than in the comfortable fragments most people choose. "That's it?" "That's quite a lot," he said. She nodded once, like a period at the end of a sentence. Then she got in her car and drove away. And Ethan stood in the parking lot for a moment in the November cold, his breath visible, his hands in his coat pockets. He drove back to Mercer Street. He stopped at the coffee truck on 5th. Too bitter, the way he liked it. He parked in front of the garage and sat in the car for a minute before getting out, looking at the sign through the windshield. His father's sign. Crooked, faded, holding. He thought about what Gerald had said. Crooked in all the right ways. He thought about Lily asking whether clouds were relieved or sad when it rained. He thought about Mara's birthday card in the drawer, the words he'd memorized, the paper he'd read so many times it had softened at the folds. He thought, I kept it. All the things I said I was keeping, I kept them. Then he got out of the car, opened the bay doors, turned on the lights, 2-second flicker, right on schedule, and picked up the day's work order. A 2017 Ford Focus with a hesitation issue under acceleration, owner's name Whitfield, drop off at 8, diagnostic requested. He got to work. Outside on Mercer Street, the November wind moved through with the particular cold intention of a season that has stopped apologizing for itself. The flowers at the base of the exterior wall had been removed. He'd done that himself, the morning after they appeared, putting them in water in the office, where they lasted another 4 days. The wall itself was unchanged. The cracked concrete at the base, the slightly uneven mortar between the bricks, the decades of small damage that had accumulated and been left because some things you leave. The sign above the bay doors moved in the wind slightly, on its bracket, still crooked, still holding. Down the street, through the corridor of empty lots and chain-link fences and the remaining buildings that had survived the development wave so far, a construction crew was working on the foundation of what would eventually become the first of Victoria Hale's towers. The sound of it reached the garage intermittently. The deep percussion of machinery doing serious work, the particular rhythm of something large being built. Ethan heard it without looking up from the Focus's engine bay. His hands were in the work, and the work was present and real, and the sound of the construction was not a threat and not a victory. It was just the city, doing what cities do, building over what was there, beside what remained, around what refused to move. The garage remained. Winter came to Mercer Street the way it always did, without asking, without ceremony, just a morning where the cold had a different quality than the morning before, and you realized the season had changed while you weren't paying attention. The construction crew working on Victoria's foundation wore heavier coats now. The machinery's exhaust hung visible in the air. The sounds carried differently in the cold, sharper, more precise, traveling further than they did in warmer months. Ethan turned the garage heat up 2 degrees and went on with things. December moved the way December does when you have a child, at 2 speeds simultaneously, slow in the day-to-day, and then suddenly, incomprehensibly fast, so that one morning you looked up and there were 3 weeks until Christmas and you hadn't bought anything yet. Lily had produced a list that was ambitious in its specificity, including a telescope, a book about ocean animals that she'd seen at the school book fair, and, written at the bottom in slightly different handwriting, as if added as an afterthought that was not actually an afterthought, more time at the garage with you on weekends. He read that last item twice. Then he folded the list and put it in his shirt pocket and drove to the bookstore that afternoon. He got her the telescope too. It was not the telescope she'd asked for. The one on her list was $40 more than was reasonable for a 7-year-old's relationship with astronomy. But it was a real one, not a toy, the kind that would actually show her the craters on the moon if she pointed it right. He spent 20 minutes in the store asking questions of a young employee who knew considerably more about telescopes than Ethan did, and who answered with the patient enthusiasm of someone who loves the subject and is glad to talk about it. "Is this for yourself?" the employee asked. "My daughter," Ethan said. "She's 7. 7's a great age for this," the employee said. "Old enough to understand what she's looking at, young enough that it still feels like magic." He bought the telescope. He bought the ocean book. He bought 3 other things that weren't on the list because they were clearly things she would want, even though she hadn't thought to want them yet, which was the specific parental privilege of knowing another person's curiosity better than they knew it themselves. Christmas morning was chaotic in the particular way of a 7-year-old encountering presents, which is to say it was loud and warm and slightly overwhelming and the best 2 hours of the month. The telescope required assembly, which took 45 minutes and 2 YouTube videos and 1 brief quiet curse word that Lily definitely heard and pretended she hadn't. When it was finally standing in the living room pointing at the window, she looked through it at the neighbor's tree and announced that she could see the individual needles, which was not quite accurate but was close enough to true that Ethan didn't correct her. "Can we take it outside tonight?" she asked. "It's going to be cold," he said. "I know. Can we, though?" They did. At 9:15, both of them in coats and gloves, the telescope set up on the small concrete slab behind the house that barely qualified as a backyard. Lily, with her eye pressed to the eyepiece, aimed at the moon. She was quiet for a long time, which was unusual enough that Ethan paid attention to the quality of the silence. "It's real," she said finally. "What is?" "The moon. I know that sounds dumb. I know it's real. But when you can see it like this..." She pulled back from the eyepiece and looked up at it with her naked eye, then back through the scope. "It's different when you can actually see it. It stops being a thing in a book and starts being a place." Ethan looked through the eyepiece after her. The moon was 3/4 full and very clear in the winter sky, the craters visible the way the telescope employee had promised, the surface textured and real and entirely indifferent to being observed. "Your mom would have liked this," he said. He said it without planning to. It came out of him the way those things sometimes did. Not from a decision to speak, but from a moment being large enough that silence felt dishonest. Lily was quiet. She'd gotten better at these moments over the years, had learned, somewhere along the way, to let them exist without needing to resolve them into something smaller. 7 was old enough for that kind of learning, apparently, when life insisted on teaching it. "What would she have said?" Lily asked. He thought about it. About Mara at the ocean on their 3rd date, standing at the waterline in the late afternoon and going completely quiet for almost 2 minutes. And when he'd asked what she was thinking, she'd said, "I keep forgetting how big things actually are. It helps to remember." She would have said it helps to remember, he said. Lily nodded seriously. Then she pressed her eye back to the telescope and went back to the moon. They stayed out there for another 20 minutes until the cold won the argument, and then they went inside and he made hot chocolate, and she fell asleep on the couch before she finished it, the mug balanced in her hand at an angle that should have spilled, but didn't. He took the mug, covered her with the blanket from the back of the couch, turned off the main light, stood in the near-dark living room looking at his daughter asleep under a blanket on Christmas night. He thought, "I would have given up everything in that back room before I would have given up this." And then he thought, she knows that. Not because he'd said it, but because children who are loved consistently know it in the body, in the specific ease of how they sleep in safe places. He thought Mara would have been glad of that. He thought his father would have been glad of it too. He went to bed. He slept well, which was something that had come back to him gradually over the months since the signing, the ability to sleep without the alert at 2 a.m. quality that had characterized the negotiation period. His body had apparently decided it was done with crisis mode. He was grateful. The new year arrived. January on Mercer Street was not photogenic. The construction site was a mud and machinery landscape that looked worse in the gray light of winter, the empty lots collecting debris in the way of spaces that have lost their original purpose and not yet found a new one. But the garage was the garage, warm inside, the smells unchanging, the work continuing with the steady rhythm of things that don't have off-seasons. Ethan hired someone in January. He'd been thinking about it for months, not because the business required it exactly, but because there was enough work that he was regularly staying past 6, and that was time he was taking from Lily, and she hadn't complained because she was 7 and generous and didn't yet know to account for what she wasn't getting, which made it worse, not better. The someone was a 24-year-old named Darius Webb, who had grown up 3 neighborhoods over, had 2 years of community college automotive training, and had found Ethan through a combination of the Herald article and a posting Ethan had put on a local jobs board that said, in its entirety, "Mechanic needed. Must know what they're doing. Cross Automotive, 447 Mercer Street." Darius came in on a Tuesday morning, shook Ethan's hand, and immediately noticed the Chevelle he was working on. It was Gerald's car again, in for what Gerald continued to insist was a sound, which continued not to be a sound, and said, without being asked, 4-barrel Holly, right? Original or replacement? Which told Ethan most of what he needed to know about whether this was going to work. Original, Ethan said. Nice, Darius said. My granddad had a 69, different color. What happened to it? Darius made a face that expressed an entire complicated family history in 2 seconds. My uncle, he said, which was apparently sufficient explanation. Okay, Ethan said. You start Monday. Darius blinked. Don't you want to? I have references. You knew what the carburetor was and you asked about its history, Ethan said. That's either someone who knows what they're doing or someone who researched it before coming in, and either one of those is fine with me. Monday. Darius started Monday. He was not perfect. He talked more than was strictly necessary during working hours, had a habit of leaving tool drawers half open that required one direct conversation to correct, and took longer on diagnostics than Ethan would have because he was still building the library of sounds and feelings that comes from years of accumulated work. But he was honest about what he didn't know, which was the quality Ethan had decided mattered most after a lifetime of working around people who weren't. When he didn't know something, he said so plainly, and then went and found out, and came back and showed his work, which was more than could be said for a lot of people with twice his experience. By February, the garage had something it hadn't had since Ethan's father was alive. The specific energy of two people working in shared purpose in the same space, the rhythm of a place that is being used by more than one person who cares about it. Lily approved of Darius. She'd met him on a Saturday when Ethan brought her in, and after approximately 4 minutes, she had determined that he could identify cloud types, which was her current metric for whether someone was worth talking to. Darius, who had done no such research, guessed correctly twice out of 3 by looking at the sky and describing what he saw plainly, which was apparently close enough. He's good, Lily told Ethan on the drive home. At cars or at clouds? Both, she said, but mainly he's honest. When he didn't know the third one, he just said he didn't know. Most adults don't do that. Ethan thought about this. You're right, he said. They don't. Why? Because adults are embarrassed about not knowing things. That's dumb, she said. Not knowing things is just the beginning of knowing things. He looked at her in the rearview mirror. She was looking out the window at something she'd spotted, already moving on to the next thing her attention had found. He thought about writing down what she'd just said, decided he'd remember it. He did remember it. He thought about it for a long time afterward. The Community Land Trust held its first board meeting in March, in a borrowed space at the public library 3 blocks from Mercer Street. Carmen Guerrero had been elected board chair at the organizational meeting in February, which had surprised no one who had met her and had required exactly 0 discussion. She ran the March meeting with an efficiency that Rosario Vega described afterward to Ethan as technically flawless and occasionally intimidating, which is exactly correct for a first meeting of a board that needs to establish it's serious. Ethan attended as a witness, not a board member. He sat in the back row and watched and did not speak, which was the right thing to do and also not easy, because there were 2 moments in the meeting where he had information that would have been useful, and he kept it to himself because this was not his institution to shape. He'd built the container. Other people were supposed to fill it. Carmen presented the endowment structure. She presented the governance documents. She presented a 6-month strategic plan for community engagement that had been put together with input from 47 residents of the former Mercer corridor, gathered through a series of listening sessions that Carmen had organized and led herself over the preceding 8 weeks. 47 people who had, for various reasons, most of them having to do with the experience of not being listened to by institutions, agreed to show up and speak. Carmen had sat in each session and written by hand, not typed, and had read back what she'd heard before moving on, which was a small thing that turned out to be a large thing. Rosario sat next to Ethan in the back row. At one point, she leaned over and said very quietly, "She's going to be fine." "I know," he whispered back. "She's going to be better than fine." "I know that too," he said. After the meeting, in the library parking lot, Carmen found him. She had her coat on and her bag over one shoulder and the look of someone who had been running on focused energy for 3 hours and was now allowing themselves to be tired. "You didn't say anything," she said. "It wasn't my place," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "There were 2 moments where you wanted to." "There were," he agreed. "What were they?" He told her. "Both things. A point about the endowment disbursement schedule and a question about the community engagement timeline that he thought was slightly too aggressive given the trust deficit that existed. She listened without interrupting, which was something he'd noticed she did consistently, the full attention without the parallel processing of a response. "The disbursement point is right," she said. "I'll fix it in the documents. The timeline? I disagree. I think the aggressive pace is a feature, not a problem. If we move slowly, people interpret it as another institution that's going to take years to do anything. We need to show results in 90 days, or we lose credibility before we have it." He thought about it. "You might be right," he said. "I might be," she said. Not falsely modest, just accurate. He drove home. The city outside the car windows was doing its spring-approaching thing. Still cold, still gray, but with a quality of light in the late afternoon that was different from January. A slight returning warmth that hadn't committed to anything yet, but was indicating its intentions. Construction on the Hale Towers was visible from the highway now. The steel structure rising above the surrounding buildings, no longer just a foundation and a disruption, but an actual shape coming into existence. He looked at it without feeling the thing he'd expected to feel, which was something like anger or loss. What he felt instead was more complicated and less clean than either of those. An acknowledgement that the city was what it was, that change was what it was, that the towers would exist and the garage would exist, and both of those things could be true simultaneously without one erasing the other. He'd spent a long time thinking that survival was the same as opposition, that keeping the garage meant resisting the change. But that wasn't quite right. He'd decided somewhere in the long months since the signing. The garage wasn't resistance, it was just itself. It didn't need to be opposed to anything to justify existing. It existed because it had value that couldn't be expressed in square footage, or assessed value or development potential. Value in the things that had happened there, the hands that had worked there, the cars that had come and gone, the years his father had put into the floor. That value didn't require anyone to recognize it. It was there regardless. The fight hadn't been to make others see it. It had been to make sure the record showed it was real, and that the cost of ignoring it was acknowledged. Those were different things, and the difference mattered. Victoria called in April. Not about business. There was no business left between them, the agreement fully implemented, the citations closed, the properties transferred, the endowment operational, the statement issued and in the record. She called because, she said, she was in the neighborhood. He didn't fully believe that. Victoria Hale did not end up in neighborhoods accidentally, but he said she could stop by if she wanted. She came in around 3 without a blazer for the first time, in a jacket that was still clearly expensive but that read as something she'd put on because it was chilly rather than because she was assembling an image. She looked different in April than she had in October. Not softer, exactly. More settled, maybe. Like someone who has made a decision they've stopped second-guessing. "The tower is on schedule," she said, 14 months ahead of the original projection. "I saw it from the highway," he said. "It's going to be—" She stopped. "I was going to say it's going to be beautiful, but that's the marketing talking. It's going to be significant, which is different." "Is it what you wanted?" he asked. She thought about it. "The building is what I wanted," she said. "The way I got here it's not what I planned." She looked at the garage around her, the familiar inventory of things she'd been looking at since October. "The Community Trust had its first programming event last week. Did you know?" "Carmen mentioned it," he said. 86 people showed up, Victoria said, for a Saturday morning workshop on tenant rights and property ownership. Something moved across her face. Not triumph, not quite. More like the particular satisfaction of a person who has done something that cost them something real and is only now seeing what it bought. 86 people on a Saturday morning, that's not nothing. "No," he said. "It's not." She looked at him. "How's the girl, Lily?" 8 in June, he said. "She's in a phase where she wants to know the name of every cloud formation she sees." "Cirrus," Victoria said. "Cumulus. Cumulonimbus." She caught his expression. "I grew up in an apartment with one window that faced east. I used to name clouds because they were the main interesting thing visible from that window." A pause. "I haven't done it in years." "You could start again," he said. "I could," she said. She said it in the tone of someone filing the idea away honestly, rather than dismissing it. "I probably won't, but I could. She stayed about 30 minutes. Darius came in from the second bay at some point, and Ethan introduced them, and Darius shook her hand and said, very naturally, with no apparent awareness of the history in the room, "You're the developer, right? The trust lady?" Which made Victoria pause and then say, "The trust was his idea?" pointing at Ethan. And Darius said, "Yeah, but you funded it," in the tone of someone who considers the funding equally important to the idea, which was the kind of practical perspective that Ethan had come to appreciate about Darius, and which Victoria seemed to find, unexpectedly, refreshing. When she left, Darius watched her car pull away and said, "She seems different from how she sounds in the articles." "Most people are," Ethan said. "Is that a good thing or a bad thing?" "Depends on the person," Ethan said. Darius considered this, nodded, went back to the second bay. May came. The city came fully alive the way it did in May, that annual reprieve from gray, the trees filling back in, people on the streets in the evenings, the particular optimism of a season that hasn't yet had time to disappoint anyone. The construction on the towers was constant now, the sound of it, a background rhythm that Ethan had absorbed so completely he only noticed it when it stopped, on weekends, in the particular quiet of machinery at rest. The Mercer Street Community Land Trust broke ground on its first project in May. Not a building yet, but a community garden on one of the returned parcels. A half-acre of land that had been a parking lot for the last 6 years, and before that, for 20 years before the original structure was demolished. The location of a dry cleaning business run by a family named Park, whose youngest son now sat on the trust's board and had been the first one to suggest the garden. It was temporary, possibly. The land was held in trust for community use and could eventually support a structure, but Carmen had argued and the board had agreed that starting with something that produced food and required tending was the right statement for a trust that was trying to reestablish what a neighborhood owed its residents and what its residents owed each other. Ethan went to the groundbreaking. It was a Saturday, and he brought Lily. She had never been to something like this. A small ceremony in a half-acre urban lot in May. Maybe 60 people, some of whom he recognized and many of whom he didn't. Carmen speaking from a small platform without notes in the way of someone who has thought about what they want to say for long enough that the notes are internal. The platform was 2 wooden pallets stacked, which was either symbolism or practicality, and was probably both. Carmen talked about her father's restaurant. She talked about the stock that her mother made on Sunday mornings. She talked about what it means to build something in a place that you love and what it costs when that thing is taken from you without your consent. And she talked about it without bitterness, which was the harder thing and the more useful one. And then she talked about the soil, literally, the soil they were standing on, the specific quality of urban soil that had been a parking lot and needed to be amended and rebuilt before it could grow anything, and how that was not a metaphor, but also, clearly, was a metaphor. "This is not going to be easy," she said, which Ethan had noticed was something she said at every significant occasion, not as a warning, but as an orientation, a refusal to let people enter a project with false expectations. Building trust takes longer than building buildings. Growing things takes patience that our culture does not always reward. We're going to do it anyway, not because it's easy, because it's ours. Lily was standing next to Ethan, her hand in his, looking at Carmen with the focused attention she reserved for things she found genuinely interesting. After Carmen finished and the clapping started, Lily leaned up and said into Ethan's ear, "She's like you." He looked down at her. "How so?" "She says things like she means them," Lily said, "and she doesn't try to make things sound nicer than they are." He squeezed her hand. She squeezed back without looking at him, already watching the first ceremonial shovels of turned earth, already locating the next thing that deserved her attention. He looked around at the lot, the 60 people in the May sun, the turned earth, the banner someone had hung on the chain-link fence that said, "Mercer Street Community Land Trust. What we build together stands." He looked at the skyline beyond the fence, where the steel frame of Victoria's tower rose against the blue, a permanent alteration to what this part of the city would look like from now on, and he looked, by reflex, over his shoulder. The garage was visible from here. The bay doors open, Darius inside working a Saturday half shift because a customer's car had needed to be ready by Monday. The sign above the doors, faded letters, slightly crooked on its bracket, turning minimally in the May wind. He'd been asked twice in the past month whether he'd considered selling the collection now that the pressure was gone. Ashford had floated the question delicately in an email, the specific delicacy of someone who knows the answer but wants to confirm. A collector in Germany had sent a letter through Ashford expressing interest in the prototype specifically, with a number attached that had required Ethan to sit down when he read it. He'd replied to both the same way. The collection was not for sale. The prototype was not for sale. Not because the number wasn't real or because he didn't understand what it represented, but because the collection was not an asset. It was a record. It was 11 months of the best work he'd ever done, and 6 more months of acquiring the other cars, and 3 years of the climate-controlled room, and all the engineering, and all the love, and all the loss that had preceded and followed it. You didn't sell the record. The record was the point. He'd thought about this decision for a long time, and he'd thought about it from different angles, and he kept arriving at the same place. The cars in that room were the last conversation he had with the version of himself that existed before everything changed, before Mara, before the garage, before he became a father and a mechanic and the man who wouldn't sell. They were the evidence that that version of himself had existed and had done real things. Selling them felt like revising that evidence, replacing it with a number. He was not interested in the number. There was one more thing that happened in May, which was not dramatic and did not make any newspapers, and which mattered more than either of those things. He was alone in the garage on a Tuesday evening, Darius gone, Lily at school, then at a playdate, then being delivered home by the other kid's parent at 7, giving Ethan the specific luxury of 2 quiet hours in the garage with no one waiting for him. He was doing a job that didn't need to be done that week, but that he'd been wanting to get to. Not a customer's car, but the garage itself. A project his father had started in 2017 and never finished, patching and sealing the concrete floor sections that had been cited in the inspections. The citations were closed, the violations were technically resolved, but the floor still had the cracks his father had poured and the years had opened, and fixing them was something Ethan wanted to do not for any legal reason, but because it was the right maintenance of a thing worth maintaining. He was on his knees with a concrete patching compound and a margin trowel, working the material into a crack that ran from the drain to the base of the parts shelf, when he noticed something he hadn't seen before. In the concrete near the wall, almost covered by the accumulated grime of decades, were 2 sets of handprints. Not decorative, not the kind of thing you press intentionally to memorialize. The kind of handprints that appear when someone is working with wet concrete and rests their hands for a moment and leaves a record of themselves without meaning to. 2 sets, adult-sized, side by side. He sat back on his heels and looked at them for a long time. His father would have been 24 when he poured this floor. He would have had help. You can't pour a concrete floor alone. Ethan didn't know who the second set of hands belonged to. His father's brother, maybe. The uncle with the loan. Or a friend from the neighborhood, someone who came to help on a Saturday because that was what people did in 1987 on Mercer Street, before it became a corridor and then a development zone, and then, slowly, something trying to find its way back to itself. Ethan put his own hand near the prints without touching them. Not quite to scale. His hands were larger than his father's had been, or maybe his father's had been this size, and the decades had compressed the impression in the concrete. He couldn't be sure. He thought about his father at 24 with his $600 and his uncle's loan, on his knees on this floor in the August heat of 1987, building something, not knowing what it would mean, not knowing that he would meet a woman over a transmission problem 2 years later, not knowing that they would have a son who would hold a wrench before he could read, not knowing that the son would go away and do remarkable things and come back, not knowing that the garage would still be here 37 years later on an evening in May, while a community garden broke ground 2 blocks away and a tower rose against the sky, and a 7-year-old girl learned to see the craters on the moon, not knowing any of it, just building. Ethan Cross, 32 years old, kneeling on his father's floor, understood in that moment something that he had been working toward understanding for a long time. Not all at once. These things don't come all at once, but clearly enough to hold on to. The things worth keeping are not the things that can't be lost. Everything can be lost. The things worth keeping are the things worth losing everything to protect. because they contain something true about who you are and where you come from and what you chose to remain in spite of everything that pressed you to become something else. His father had built a garage because he believed in building things. Mara had loved a man who stayed in motion because she believed in staying in motion. Carmen Guerrero was building a garden on a parking lot because she believed that soil could be rebuilt and trust could be rebuilt, and the two were not entirely different. Lily was learning the names of clouds because she believed, with the full confidence of someone who hasn't yet been told that certainty is naive, that naming things is how you start to understand them. And Ethan Cross had held a line, not out of stubbornness, not out of pride, not out of a refusal to be reasonable, but because some lines exist not to be held forever, but to be held long enough. Long enough to prove that they can be held. Long enough to establish that the things on one side of the line have value that the things on the other side cannot simply purchase away. He'd held it long enough. He finished the crack repair, moved to the next one, working his way across the floor methodically, the way his father would have, the way all careful work gets done. One section at a time, patient, attending to what's in front of you. By the time he was done, the light through the high windows had gone amber with the approaching evening. He cleaned the trowel, sealed the compound container, stood up slowly with the complaint in his knees that had started appearing in the last year and that he refused to regard as significant. He washed his hands at the utility sink. He stood in the middle of his garage and looked at what it was. The tools and the lifts and the parts and the board with its invoices and Lily's drawing in the corner, faded now from the month-by-month work of being present in a working space. He looked at the floor he'd just repaired, still damp with compound. He looked at the handprints near the wall that he'd decided not to fill. He left those alone. Some things you don't fix because they're broken. You leave them because they're real. He turned off the lights. The far bay first, then the office, then the main bay last, pulling the door shut behind him. The lock turned with the specific sound of a mechanism that has been used many thousands of times and knows its function completely. Outside on Mercer Street, the May evening was warm and blue, and the city was in the middle of its best hour, that hour before dark, when the light goes horizontal, and everything that the light touches looks like it was specifically placed to receive it. The construction site 2 blocks over was quiet, the machinery at rest, the steel frame standing against the sky with the particular patience of things that are in the process of becoming permanent. Ethan looked at the sign above the bay doors, his father's sign. Faded at the edges, letters slightly uneven, hanging at its particular angle that was not level and had never been level and would not be made level. He got in his car. He drove to pick up his daughter. The sign stayed where it was, which was where it had always been, which was exactly where it belonged. And on Mercer Street, the May wind moved through the spaces between things, between the garage and the empty lots, between what had been demolished and what had been built, between what was still coming and what had decided to stay, and the sign moved with it, slightly, on its bracket, the way things move when they're rooted well enough that movement doesn't threaten them. It held. It would keep holding. That was the whole story, and it was enough.